That's the end of Prime Minister's questions. Here's Jeremy Hunt.
Before I call the Chancellor, it may help the House if I set out how proceedings on the autumn statement will unfold. Once the Chancellor has delivered his statement, copies of the resolutions relating to the statement will be made available in the Vote Office and online. I will then call the Shadow Chancellor and other honourable members to ask questions. This will follow the usual pattern for a ministerial statement. At the end of questions on the statement, the Chancellor will be called to move a motion under Section 5 of the Provisional Collection of Taxes Act 1968. The question on this motion must be put without debate. We will then proceed to do the debate on the autumn statement resolutions. A minister will move the first of the resolutions and open the debate. Debate will take place over 3 days, concluding on Monday. At the end of the debate on Monday, the question on the first of the resolutions will be disposed of, and the questions on the remaining resolutions will then be taken formally without further debate. I now call the Chancellor to make the autumn statement. Jeremy Hunt.
Mr. Speaker, I come today with good news. It's my wife's birthday, and unlike me, she's looking younger every year. I turn to the statement. After a global pandemic and energy crisis, we have taken difficult decisions to put our economy back on track. We've supported families with rising bills, cut borrowing and halved inflation. Rather than a recession, the economy has grown. Rather than falling as predicted, real incomes have risen. Our plan for the British economy is working, but the work is not done. Others proposed a more short-term approach, but we have not made unaffordable pay offers to the unions. We have not stopped new oil and gas exploration, and we have not increased borrowing by £28 billion a year. That would have pushed inflation up just when we need to bring it down. Instead, under this Prime Minister, we take decisions for the long term. In today's autumn statement for growth, our choice is not big government, high spending and high tax, because we know that leads to less growth, not more. Instead, we reduce debt, cut taxes and reward work. We deliver world-class education. We build domestic sustainable energy, and we back British business with 110 growth measures. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through them all, but well, I will if you like. But in summary, Mr. Speaker, they remove planning red tape, they speed up access to the national grid, they support entrepreneurs raising capital, they get behind our fastest growing industries, they unlock foreign direct investment, they boost productivity, they reform welfare, they level up opportunity to every corner of the country, and they cut business taxes. The Office for Budget Responsibility say that the combined impact of these measures will raise business investment, get more people into work, reduce inflation next year and increase GDP. But Conservatives also know that a dynamic economy depends on the energy and enterprise of people more than any diktats or decisions by ministers. So today's measures do not just remove barriers to investment, they reward effort and work. And I'll go through the measures in three parts. In the first, I'll use updated OBR forecasts to show the progress we're making against the Prime Minister's economic priorities. The second part sets out growth measures to back British business. Finally, I conclude with measures to make work pay. Before I start with the forecasts, I want to express my horror at the murderous attack on Israeli citizens on October the 7th and the subsequent loss of life on both sides. I will remember for the rest of my life, as I know many other honourable members will, being taken to Auschwitz by Rabbi Barry Marcus and the remarkable Holocaust Educational Trust. But I'm deeply concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism in our country. So I'm announcing up to £7 million over the next 3 years for organisations like the Holocaust Education Trust to tackle anti-Semitism in schools and universities. I will also repeat the £3 million uplift to the Community Security Trust. When it comes to anti-Semitism and all forms of racism, we must never allow the clock to be turned back. I now move on to the OBR's economic and fiscal forecasts, and I thank Richard Hughes and his team for their sterling work in preparing them. 3 of my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister's 5 pledges at the start of the year were economic: to halve inflation, grow the economy and reduce debt. Today I can report to the House that we are delivering on all 3. Let's start with inflation. Now, the Shadow Chancellor didn't mention it in her conference speech. My conference speech was before hers, so all she had to do was a bit of copying and pasting, which I've heard she's good at. But it speaks volumes that during the worst global inflation shock for a generation, it didn't even get a mention. Well, if controlling inflation isn't a priority for Labour, it is for us. When the Prime Minister and I took office, inflation was 11.1%. Last week it fell to 4.6%. We promised to halve inflation and we have halved it. Core inflation is now lower than in nearly half the economies in the EU, and the OBR say that headline inflation will fall to 2.8% by the end of 2024 before falling to the 2% target in 2025. I will not take risks with inflation, and the OBR confirm that the measures I take today make inflation lower next year than it would otherwise have been. I thank the Independent Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee for their crucial role in bringing inflation down, and we will continue to back them to do whatever it takes until the job is done. But as we do, we will continue to support families in difficulty. And today I add 4 further measures to help with the cost of living. Firstly, for those on the lowest incomes, I understand the concerns some have about the effect on work incentives of matching benefit increases to inflation. I know there's been some speculation that we would increase benefits next year by the lower October figure for inflation. But cost of living pressures remain at their most acute for the poorest families. So instead, the government has decided to increase universal credit and other benefits from next April by 6.7%, in line with September's inflation figure, an average increase of £470 for 5.5 million households next year. Vital support to those on the very lowest incomes from a compassionate Conservative government. Second, because rent can constitute more than half the living costs of private renters on the lowest incomes, I've listened closely to many colleagues, as well as the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the Resolution Foundation, Citizens Advice UK, and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who said that unfreezing the local housing allowance was an urgent priority. I will therefore increase the local housing allowance rate to the 30th percentile of local market rents. This will give 1.6 million households an average of £800 of support next year. Third, although I'm going to increase duty on hand-rolling tobacco by an additional 10% above the tobacco duty escalator, I know that for many people, going to the pub has become more expensive. I've listened closely to the persuasive arguments on alcohol duties from my honourable friend for Murray and my right honourable friend for Dumfriesshire, Clydesdale and Tweedsdale, fierce champions of the Scotch whisky industry. I've also listened to defenders of the great British pint, such as my right honourable friends for the Vale of Glamorgan and Buckingham. In my own constituency, to Councillor Jane Austen, who is a big supporter of the Jolly Farmer pub in Bramley, and indeed to the Sun newspaper. So, as well as confirming our Brexit pubs guarantee, which means the duty on a pint is always lower than in the shops, I have decided to freeze all alcohol duty until August the 1st next year. That means no increase in duty on beer, cider, wine or spirits. Finally, pensioners. The triple lock has helped lift 250,000 older people out of poverty since it was instituted by a Conservative government in 2011. It's been a lifeline for many during a period of high inflation. There have been reports that we would uprate it by a lower amount to smooth out the effect of high public sector bonuses in July, but that would have been particularly difficult for 1 million pensioners whose only income is from the state. So instead, today, we honour our commitment to the triple lock in full. From April 24, we will increase the full new state pension by 8.5% to £221.20 a week, worth up to £900 more a year. This is one of the largest ever cash increases to the state pension, showing a Conservative government will always back our pensioners. Including today's measures, our total commitment to easing cost of living pressures has risen to £104 billion. That includes paying around half the cost of the average energy bill since last October, and amounts now to an average of £3,700 per household. We are able to do that only because we reduced the deficit by 80% ahead of the pandemic, which the party opposite might reflect on, having opposed us every step of the way. Next, I turn to my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister's pledge to reduce debt. Before I took difficult decisions in last year's autumn statement, debt was predicted to rise to almost 100% of GDP by the end of the forecast. Since then, the economy has outperformed expectations, and I've taken difficult decisions to reduce borrowing. As a result, headline debt is now predicted to be 94% of GDP by the end of the forecast. The OBR today forecast underlying debt will be 91.6% of GDP next year, 92.7% in 24-5, 93.2% in 26-7, before declining in the final 2 years of the forecast to 92.8% in 28-29. That is lower in every year compared to forecasts in the spring. We therefore meet our fiscal rule to have underlying debt falling as a percentage of GDP in the final year of the forecast, with double the headroom compared to the OBR's March forecast. And we will continue to have the second lowest government debt in the G7, lower than the United States, Canada, France, Italy or Japan. I turn to borrowing. The Right Honourable Lady opposite said when it comes to borrowing, she will take it up to £28 billion a year. Take it up, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, she has opposed every decision we have made to reduce our borrowing. But, Mr. Speaker, this side of the House will bring borrowing down because, as the late Lord Lawson said, borrowing is just a deferred tax on future generations. Now, I see the Leader of the Opposition shaking his head. In fact, we do have something in common. Both he and I wanted to make a Jeremy Prime Minister. In fairness, his party and mine are probably equally relieved we failed. But whereas this Jeremy is growing the economy, his Jeremy would have crashed it. And the numbers... And the numbers show the contrast. According to the OBR, borrowing is lower this year and next, and on average across the forecast by 0.7 billion every year compared to the spring budget forecast. It falls from 4.5% of GDP in 23-4 to 3%, 2.7%, 2.3%, 1.6% and 1.1% in 28-29. That means we also meet our second fiscal rule, that public sector borrowing must be below 3% of GDP, not just by the final year, but in almost every year of the forecast. Some of this improvement is from higher tax receipts from a stronger economy, but we also maintain a disciplined approach to public spending. As I set out in the spring budget, resource spending will increase by 1% a year from 25.6 in real terms, and we are sustaining the record 2020 increase in capital spending in cash terms until the end of the forecast. Within this, we will meet our NATO commitment to spend 2% of GDP on defence, critical at a time of global threats to the international order, most notably from Putin's evil war in Ukraine. We also support a group of people to whom we owe our freedom, our brave veterans. I will extend national insurance relief for employers of eligible veterans for a further year and provide £10 million to support the Veterans, Places, Pathways and People programme, and I thank our excellent Veterans Minister for his championing of their cause. We have shown that we are prepared to increase funding for vital public services, with record numbers of police officers, doctors, nurses and teachers. We're nearly doubling the numbers of doctors and nurses we train, having given the NHS its first ever long-term workforce plan, as I promised to do a year ago. We're also tackling the biggest single preventable cause of mortality the NHS has to deal with by bringing forward plans for a smoke-free generation. But alongside extra funding and support, we need to see reform. We need a more productive state, not a bigger state. And that is why I want the public sector to increase productivity growth by at least 0.5% a year, the level at which the size of our state starts to reduce as a proportion of GDP. I've already announced plans to cap and reduce the size of the civil service to pre-pandemic levels. Today, I pay tribute to my friend, the former Chief Secretary of the Treasury, the Right Honourable Member for Salisbury, who started our brilliant public sector productivity programme. It will now be pursued by his formidable successor, the Right Honourable Member for Sevenoaks, who has already been with me to meet police, fire and ambulance personnel to understand why bureaucracy is holding them back. And through this vital work, we will ensure that over time, the growth in public spending is lower than the growth in the economy, whilst always protecting the services the public value. And I will also provide HMRC with the resources they need to ensure everyone pays the tax they owe, raising an additional £5 billion across the forecast period. My right honourable friend also promised to grow the economy. Since 2010, despite inheriting what was then the worst recession since the Second World War, Conservative administrations have presided over faster growth than many of our major competitors, including Spain, Italy, France. Well, they don't like to hear this, but let me tell them the list. Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, Netherlands, Austria, Germany, Japan. We've grown faster than all of them since 2010. But all those countries have faced a pandemic and an energy shock, and as a result, last autumn, the OBR forecast a recession in which the economy was forecast to shrink by 1.4% this year. Instead, it grew. In fact, it's grown faster than the euro area. Revised numbers from the ONS now say the economy is 1.8% larger than pre-pandemic. And looking ahead, the OBR expects the economy to grow by 0.6% this year and 0.7% next. After that, growth rises to 1.4% in 25, then 1.9%, 2% and 1.7% in 28. If we want those numbers to be higher, we need higher productivity. The private sector is more productive in countries like the United States, Germany and France because it invests more, on average 2 percentage points more of GDP every year. The 110 measures I take today help close that gap by boosting business investment by £20 billion a year. They do not involve borrowing more and ramping up debt, as some advocate. Instead, they unlock investment with supply-side reforms that back British business in the following areas. First, skills. No economy can prosper without investing in the potential of its people. Despite strong opposition, we took difficult decisions to reform our schools. England's 9 to 10-year-olds are now the 4th best readers in the world. And since 2015, our 15 to 16-year-olds have risen 7 places in the OECD rankings for maths, not least thanks to the efforts of the brilliant Right Honourable Member for Bognor Regis and Littlehampton. But 9 million adults in England still have low basic literacy or numeracy skills. So last month, the Prime Minister set out the new Advanced British Standard to ensure all school leavers reach minimum standards in maths and English. And while the party opposite wants to reduce the number of apprentices, we want to increase them. So, following engagement with Make UK and others, I'm announcing a further £50 million of funding over the next 2 years to pilot ways to increase the number of apprentices in engineering and other key growth sectors where there are shortages. Next, planning. It takes too long. There's 110 of these measures, so just be patient, folks. I move on to planning. It takes too long to approve infrastructure projects and business planning applications. Many businesses say they would be willing to pay more if they knew their application would be approved faster. So from next year, working with the Community Secretary, I will reform the system to allow local authorities to recover the full costs of major business planning applications in return for being required to meet guaranteed faster timelines. If they fail, fees will be refunded automatically, with the application being processed free of charge. A prompt service or your money back, just as would be the case in the private sector. Now, many planning applications are for house building. The Leader of the Opposition told us he wanted to be a builder, not a blocker. It didn't last long. Just a few months later, Labour blocked reforms to the rules on nutrient neutrality, shamelessly preventing 100,000 houses from being built. Conservatives, on the other hand, are the builders, with more homes being completed in 21-22 than any single year of the last Labour government. And today, we take further decisions to unlock the building of more homes. We'll invest £110 million over this year and next to deliver high-quality nutrient mitigation schemes, unlocking 40,000 homes. We'll invest £32 million to bust the planning backlog and develop fantastic new housing quarters in Cambridge, London and Leeds, which will lead to many thousands of additional dwellings. We'll allocate £450 million to the Local Authority Housing Fund to deliver 2,400 new homes, and we'll consult on a new permitted development right to allow any house to be converted into 2 flats, provided the exterior remains unaffected. It's also taking too long for clean energy businesses to access the electricity grid. So after talking to businesses such as National Grid, Octopus Energy and SSE, we today publish our full response to the Windsor Review and Connections Action Plan. These measures will cut grid access delays by 90% and offer up to £10,000 off electricity bills over 10 years for those living closest to new transmission infrastructure. Taken together, these planning and grid reforms are estimated to accelerate around £90 billion of additional business investment over the next 10 years. Next, foreign direct investment. I'm extremely grateful to Lord Harrington for his excellent report on how to increase foreign direct investment. We accept all his headline recommendations, and in particular will put in place a concierge service for large international investors, modelled on the best such services offered by our competitors, and will increase funding for the Office for Investment to deliver it. I now turn to reforms to pension funds that will increase the flow of capital going to our most promising growth companies in a way that also improves outcomes for savers. I'll take forward my Mansion House reforms, starting with measures to consolidate the industry. By 2030, the majority of workplace DC savers will have their pension pots managed in schemes over £30 billion, and by 2040, all local government pension funds will be invested in pools of £200 billion or more. I'll support the establishment of investment vehicles for pension funds to use, including through the LIFTS competition, a new growth fund run by the British Business Bank, and opening the PPF as an investment vehicle for smaller DB pension schemes. I will also consult on giving savers a legal right to require a new employer to pay pension contributions into their existing pension pot if they choose, meaning people can move to having one pension pot for life. These reforms could unlock an extra £75 billion of financing for high-growth companies by 2030 and provide an extra £1,000 a year in retirement for an average earner saving from 18. Alongside this, I'm also proposing further capital market reforms to boost the attractiveness of our markets and make sure the UK remains one of the most attractive places to start, grow and list a company. And as part of this, I will explore options for a NatWest retail share offer in the next 12 months, subject to market conditions and achieving value for money. It's time to get SID investing again. Yeah. Next, I move on to measures to support our most innovative industries. In the last decade, under Conservatives, we have grown to become the third largest technology sector in the world, double the size of Germany, 3 times the size of France, the biggest life science industry in Europe, Europe's third largest generator of renewable electricity after Germany and Norway, and the 8th largest manufacturer in the world. When it comes to tech, we know that AI will be at the heart of any future growth. I want to make sure our universities, scientists, and startups can access the compute power they need. So building on the success of the supercomputing centres in Edinburgh and Bristol, I'll invest a further £500 million over the next 2 years to fund further innovation centres to help make us an AI powerhouse. Our creative industries already support Europe's largest film and TV sector. This year's all-Californian blockbuster Barbie was filmed in the constituency of the Honourable Member for Watford, where, of course, the sun always shines. I know that even more could be invested in visual effects if we increase the generosity of the film and high-end TV tax credits, so I'll today launch a call for evidence on how to make that happen. British-discovered vaccines and treatments saved more lives across the world during the pandemic than those from any other country, and I'm incredibly proud of our life sciences industry. To further support research and development, I'm creating a new simplified R&D tax relief, combining the existing R&D expenditure credit and SME schemes. I'll also reduce the rate at which loss-making companies are taxed within the merged scheme from 25% to 19%, and lower the threshold for the additional support for R&D intensive loss-making SMEs that I announced in the spring to 30%, benefiting a further 5,000 SMEs. And because 2028 marks the centenary of the invention of penicillin by Alexander Fleming, I'm giving £5 million to Imperial College and Imperial College Healthcare NHS Trust to set up a Fleming Centre to inspire the next generation of world-changing innovations. For our advanced manufacturing and green energy sectors, international investors say the biggest thing we could do is to announce a longer-term strategy for their industries. So with the Secretaries of State for Business and Trade and Energy Security and Net Zero, I'm today publishing those plans. I confirm that we'll make available £4.5 billion of support over the 5 years to 2030 to attract investment into strategic manufacturing sectors. That includes support of £2 billion for zero-emission investments in the automotive sector, something that's been warmly welcomed by Nissan and Toyota, £975 million for aerospace, building on decades of success from firms like Airbus and Rolls-Royce, and £520 million for life sciences to build on the strength of world-class British pharma companies like AstraZeneca and GSK. We'll also provide £960 million for the new Green Industries Growth Accelerator focused on offshore wind, electricity networks, nuclear, CCUS and hydrogen. These targeted investments will ensure the UK remains competitive in sectors where we're already leaders and innovative in sectors where we're not. And taken together across our fastest growing innovation sectors, this support will attract an estimated £2 billion of additional investment every year over the next decade. One of the reasons we support our manufacturing and clean energy sectors is they help to level up growth across the United Kingdom. So I now turn to further levelling up measures. In the spring, I announced we deliver 12 new investment zones, 12 mini Canary Wharfs, where government, industry and research institutes collaborate across the UK. Since then, the Exchequer Secretary, the Honourable Member for Grantham and Stamford, has done outstanding work across government to bring this vision to fruition. Following tenacious representations by the Honourable Member for Innis Mon, without whom a mention would mean that no Chancellor's speech was complete, and representations from the unstoppable Mayor of Tees Valley, I have today decided to extend the financial incentives for investment zones and the tax reliefs for free ports from 5 years to 10 years. I will also set up a £150 million investment opportunity fund to catalyse investment into the programme. Now, on Monday, I confirmed a new investment zone in West Yorkshire. Today, having listened to representations from the West Midlands Salesman-in-Chief Andy Street, as well as the Honourable Member for Mansfield and the Honourable Member for Bury North, I am announcing 3 further investment zones focused on advanced manufacturing in the West Midlands, East Midlands and Greater Manchester. Together, local partners expect these will help catalyse over £3 billion of private investment and 65,000 new jobs. And having listened to the Honourable Member for Wrexham and the Honourable Member for Clwyd South, I can announce a second investment zone in Wales in the fantastic region of Wrexham and Flintshire, which I will visit tomorrow. We're publishing new devolution deals with 4 areas, including Hull and East Yorkshire, and offering devolved powers to even more county areas. One of those areas will be the leafiest and most charming county in the country, namely Surrey, where, of course, the Leader of the Opposition grew up. We don't get everything right. On Monday, we saw the announcement of £1 billion of funding through round 3 of the Levelling Up Fund, supporting projects following the campaigning efforts of the members for Keighley, Dewsbury, Doncaster, Scunthorpe, and, of course, Mr. Speaker, Chorley. I can also confirm that we will proceed with over £50 million of funding for high-quality regeneration projects in communities such as Bolsover, Monmouthshire, Warrington and Eden Valley, all of which have particularly effective local MPs as their champions. And because we are proudly the Conservative and Unionist Party, I'm announcing £80 million for the new Levelling Up partnerships in Scotland, £500,000 to support the Hay Festival in Wales, and £3 million of additional funding to support the successful Tackling Paramilitarism programme in Northern Ireland. Next, small business. I ran my own one for 14 years, and I've always known that every big business was a small business once. The Federation of Small Businesses say the biggest thing I could do to help their members is end the scourge of late payments. The Procurement Act we've passed means that the 30-day payment terms, which are already set for public sector contracts, will automatically apply throughout the subcontract supply chain. But from April 24, I'll also introduce a condition that any company bidding for large government contracts should demonstrate they pay their own invoices within an average of 55 days, which will reduce progressively to 30 days. Any small business will also tell you the biggest frustration they have is the tax you pay before making a penny of profit, not least business rates. Now, the government has already taken a third of properties out of rates completely through small business rates relief. We've frozen the tax rate for the last 3 years at a cost of £14.5 billion. We've removed downwards caps from transitional relief, And for retail, hospitality and leisure businesses, we've introduced a one-year 75% discount on business rates up to £110,000. And those measures have saved the average independent shop over £20,000. It's not possible to continue with temporary support measures forever. But whilst the standard multiplier, which applies to high-value properties, will rise in line with inflation, I have today decided that we will freeze the small business multiplier for a further year. And following extensive discussions with the FSB and many colleagues in this House, I've also decided to extend the 75% business rates discount for retail, hospitality and leisure for another year. This will save the average independent pub over £12,800 next year, and at a cost of £4.3 billion is a large tax cut which recognises the role of pubs and high street shops in our communities. I thank the members for Stockton South, Barrow and Furness and East Devon for their tenacious campaigning on this issue. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I turn to the smallest of all businesses, those run by the self-employed. These are the people who literally kept our country running during the pandemic. The plumbers who fixed our boilers in lockdowns, the delivery drivers who bought us our shopping, the farmers who kept food on our plates. As part of our plans to grow the economy, I want to reform and simplify taxes paid by the self-employed. So today I'm announcing a major reform of one of those taxes. It's one most people haven't heard of, but it's a big deal for those who have to pay it. Class 2 national insurance is a flat rate, compulsory charge, currently £3.45 a week, paid by self-employed people earning more than £12,570, which gives state pension entitlement. Today, after careful consideration and in recognition of the contribution made by self-employed people to our country, I can announce that we are abolishing Class 2 national insurance altogether, saving the average self-employed person £192 a year. Access to entitlements and credits will be maintained in full, and those who choose to pay voluntarily will still be able to do so. But this change simplifies and cuts tax for nearly 2 million self-employed people, whilst protecting the interest of those on the lowest pay. And because we value their work, I'm taking one further step for the self-employed. They also pay Class 4 national insurance at 9% on all earnings between £12,570 and £50,270. Today, I've decided to cut that tax by 1 percentage point to 8% from April. Taken together with the abolition of the compulsory Class 2 charge, these reforms will save around 2 million self-employed people an average of £350 a year from April. Mr. Speaker, we're backing small business by freezing their business rates, extending retail, hospitality and leisure relief, abolishing compulsory Class 2 national insurance payments and reducing Class 4 national insurance by 1 percentage point in today's autumn statement for growth. Small businesses work so hard for us, and a Conservative government today is working hard for them. I turn now to my final measure to back British business, Mr. Speaker. As I said, since 2010, we have seen the second highest growth in investment of any G7 country. However, if we're to raise productivity, we need to increase business investment further. In 2021, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, introduced the super deduction for large businesses to further stimulate business investment. And this spring, I introduced full expensing for 3 years. This means that for every £1 million a company invests, they get £250,000 off their tax bill in the very same year. The CBI, Make UK, the BCC, Energy UK, and 200 other business leaders from companies including BT Openreach, Siemens and Bosch have said that making this measure permanent would be the single most transformational thing I could do for business investment and growth. The Centre for Policy Studies say it would maximise business investment, boost productivity and deliver higher levels of GDP. But because it costs £11 billion a year, I made clear that I would only do so when it was affordable. Well, with inflation halved, borrowing down and debt falling, today I deliver on that promise. I will today make full expensing permanent. That is the largest business tax cut in modern British history. It means we have not just the lowest headline corporation tax rate in the G7, but its most generous capital allowances. The OBR say this will increase annual investment by around £3 billion a year and a total of £14 billion over the forecast period. We know on this side of the House the way to back British business is not to borrow more or subsidise more, but to increase the incentives to invest. And we do that today by introducing one of the most generous tax reliefs anywhere in the world, a huge boost to British competitiveness in an autumn statement for growth. Skills, planning, infrastructure reform, pension fund reform, support for innovation industries, levelling up, backing small businesses, and full expensing. Under Labour, business investment was 9.3% of GDP in real terms. Since 2010, it's been 9.8% of GDP. But today we go further because taken together, the overall impact of today's growth measures will be to increase business investment in the UK economy by around £20 billion a year within the decade, nearly 1% of GDP at today's level. This is the biggest ever boost for business investment in modern times, a decisive step towards closing the productivity gap with other major economies, and the most effective way we can raise wages and living standards for every family in the country. Now, as well as backing business, Conservatives know you need to back the people without whose effort no business can succeed. The entrepreneur taking risks, the builder working weekends, the nurse working nights, and the job seeker leaving benefits behind. I therefore conclude with 3 further supply-side reforms designed to improve the incentives to work in a modern, dynamic economy. And I begin with welfare, and I want to start by thanking the outstanding Work and Pensions Secretary for his help in developing these reforms. He builds on the work of my right honourable friend for Chingford and Woodford Green, who introduced universal credit. Those reforms helped reduce unemployment, which has fallen by over 1 million, but to their shame, the party opposite voted against them 30 times. Because they think compassion is about giving money, we think it's about giving opportunity. But post-pandemic, we still have over 7 million adults of working age, excluding students, who are not working, despite 1 million vacancies in the economy. Many can and want to work, but our system makes that too hard. In the spring budget, I announced 30 hours of free childcare for working parents of 1 to 2-year-olds. That plan, still opposed by the party opposite, starts rolling out in April. It will help tens of thousands of parents return to work without having to worry about damaging their career prospects. Today, we focus on helping those with sickness or disability and the long-term unemployed. Every year, we sign off over 100,000 people onto benefits with no requirement to look for work because of sickness or disability. That waste of potential is wrong economically and wrong morally. So with the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, last week I announced our Back to Work plan. We will reform the fit note process so that treatment rather than time off becomes the default. We'll reform the work capability assessment to reflect greater flexibility and availability of home working after the pandemic. And we'll spend £1.3 billion over the next 5 years to help nearly 700,000 people with health conditions find jobs. Over 180,000 more people will be helped through the Universal Support Programme, and nearly 500,000 more people will be offered treatment for mental health conditions and employment support. Over the forecast period, the OBR judged these measures will more than halve the flow of people who are signed off work with no work search requirements. At the same time, we'll provide a further £1.3 billion of funding to offer extra help to the 300,000 people who've been unemployed for over a year without any sickness or disability. But we will ask for something in return. If after 18 months of intensive support, job seekers have not found a job, we'll roll out a programme requiring them to take part in mandatory work placement to increase their skills and improve their employability. And if they choose not to engage with the work search process for 6 months, we will close their case and stop their benefits. Taken together with the labour supply measures I announced in the spring, the OBR say we will increase the number of people in work by around 200,000 at the end of the forecast period, permanently increasing the size of the economy. Now, I know that some on the benches opposite would prefer to fill those vacancies in a different way. They hanker after a more liberal immigration regime, or even dream of bringing back free movement. But Conservatives say we should unlock the potential we have right here at home. And we do that with the biggest set of welfare reforms in a decade in today's autumn statement for growth. Now, Mr. Speaker, if we're to incentivise work, we must also tackle low pay. People who get up early, put in the hours and work hard for their families deserve to be paid fairly. Since 2010, those on the minimum wage, now the national living wage, have seen their hourly wage go up from £5.80 an hour to £10.42 an hour. That's a real terms increase of more than 20%. Because we've also doubled the threshold at which you pay tax or national insurance, their after-tax income has gone up not by 20%, but by 25% more than any other income group. Today, I confirm we'll go further and accept the Low Pay Commission recommendation to increase the national living wage by 9.8% to £11.44 an hour. That is the largest ever cash increase in the national living wage, worth up to £1,800 for a full-time worker. And since the national living wage has been introduced, the proportion of people on low pay, defined as earning less than 2/3 of national median hourly income, has halved. But at the new rate of £11.44 an hour, it delivers our manifesto commitment to eliminate low pay altogether. That means by next year, someone working full-time on the national living wage will see their real take-home after-tax pay go up not by 25%, but by 30% compared to 2010. And that is the difference. The party opposite tried to reduce poverty by tinkering with benefits and tax credits. They wanted to move people from just below the poverty line to just above it. But Conservatives know the best way to tackle poverty is through work. By reforming the welfare system, reducing workless households and tackling low pay, we have helped lift 1.7 million people out of absolute poverty since 2010, because a central part of our plan for growth is to make work pay. And so, Mr. Speaker, to the final supply-side measure in today's autumn statement for growth. Because of the difficult decisions that we've taken in the last year, today's OBR forecast shows that borrowing will be lower than forecast in the spring. Debt as a proportion of GDP will be lower than forecast in the spring. Inflation will continue to fall, and our fiscal headroom has doubled. I said I would cut taxes when we could, but only responsibly and only in a way that did not fuel inflation. The OBR today confirm I can deliver a package which does that. For businesses, I've today delivered the biggest business tax cut in modern British history, with the most competitive investment allowances of any large economy. For the self-employed, I've simplified and reformed their taxes by abolishing the compulsory Class 2 charge and cutting Class 4 national insurance. But high employment taxes on 27 million people working in the public and private sectors also disincentivise the hard work we should be encouraging. On top of income tax at 20%, they pay 12% national insurance on earnings between $12,570 and $50,270. That is a 32% marginal tax rate. If we want people to get up early in the morning, if we want them to work nights, if we want an economy where people go the extra mile and work hard, then we need to recognise that their hard work benefits us all. So today, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to cut the main 12% rate of employee national insurance. If I cut it by 1 percentage point to 11%, that would be an extra £225 in the pockets of the average worker every year. But instead, I'm going to go further and cut the main rate of employee national insurance by 2 percentage points from 12% to 10%. That change will help 27 million people. It means someone on the average salary of £35,000 will save over £450. For the average nurse, it's a saving of £520. For the typical police officer, a saving of £630 every single year. And Mr. Speaker, I would normally bring in a measure like this from the start of the new tax year in April. But instead, tomorrow, I'm introducing urgent legislation to bring it in from January the 6th. So people can see the benefit in their payslips at the start of the new year. The OBR say reducing a tax on work means more people in work. And they say today's measures will, just on national insurance, will lead to the equivalent of 94,000 full-time employees in our economy. Because lower tax means higher growth. And that is the difference between this side and that one. In 13 years, Labour raised taxes in every single budget, but Conservatives cut taxes when we responsibly can. And today, we do just that. We cut taxes to help bigger businesses invest. We cut taxes to help smaller businesses grow. We cut taxes for the self-employed who keep our country running. And from January, we cut taxes for 27 million working people whose hard work drives our economy forward. Mr. Speaker, the best universities, the cleverest scientists, the smartest entrepreneurs have given us Europe's most innovative economy. But we can be the most prosperous too. In the face of global challenges, we've halved inflation, reduced our debt and grown our economy. As a country, we're sticking to a plan that's working, and this autumn statement for growth will attract £20 billion additional business investment a year in the next decade, bring tens of thousands of people into work and support our fastest growing industries in a package which leaves borrowing lower, debt lower and keeps inflation falling. We are delivering the biggest business tax cut in modern British history, the largest ever cut to employee and self-employed national insurance, and the biggest package of tax cuts to be implemented since the 1980s. An autumn statement for a country that has turned a corner, an autumn statement for growth, which I commend to the House.
I now call the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, the Chancellor has lifted the lid on 13 years of economic failure. We were told that this was to be an autumn statement for growth, but the economy is now forecast to be £40 billion smaller by 2027 than the Chancellor said back in March. Growth revised down. Next year, the year after, and the year after that too. The Chancellor claims that the economy has turned a corner. Yet the truth is that under the Conservatives, growth has hit a dead end. What has been laid bare today is the full scale of the damage that this government has done to our economy over 13 years. And nothing that has been announced today will remotely compensate. Mortgages rising, taxes eating into wages, inflation high with prices still going up in the shops, public services on their knees, and too many families struggling to make ends meet. As the sun begins to set on this divided, out of touch, weak government, the only conclusion that the British people will reach is this. After 13 years of Conservatives, the economy is simply not working, and despite all the promises today, working people are still worse off. Mr. Speaker, the centrepiece of today's autumn statement is a cut in the headline rate of national insurance. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm old enough to remember when the Prime Minister wanted to put up national insurance. As recently as January last year, he said, and I quote, "We must go ahead with the increase in the health and care levy. It is progressive in that the burden falls most on those who can most afford it." Utter nonsense. It was a tax on working people, and we opposed it for that very reason. Yet again, the Prime Minister is left arguing against himself. In response to last year's autumn statement, I warned that the government was pickpocketing working people through stealth taxes. I have long argued that taxes on working people are too high. Indeed, I said in my conference speech that I want them to be lower. From their failure to uprate income tax or national insurance bans, to forcing councils to raise council tax, the Conservatives have pushed the costs of their failure onto others. But the British people won't be taken for fools. They know that what has been announced today owes more to the cynicism of a party desperate to cling onto power than the real priorities of this high-tax, low-growth Conservative government. So I think that we can forgive taxpayers for not celebrating when they see the truth behind today's announcements. Going into this statement, the government had already put in place tax increases worth the equivalent of a 10p increase in national insurance. So today's 2p cut will not remotely compensate for the tax increases already put in place by this Conservative government. The fact is that taxes will be higher at the next election than they were at the last. This is the legacy of the Conservatives, and that, Mr. Speaker, is their record. Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor and Prime Minister have spent the last 2 weeks marching their MPs up a hill, only to march them down again on inheritance tax. Now, let's not forget, when they realised that they had money to spend...
Mr. Kearns, I've had you chirping all the way through. Either go and get yourself that cup of tea or be quiet. Rachel Rees.
When they realised that they had money to spend, this government's first instinct was a tax cut for millionaires. But in the end, even they realised that they couldn't get away with it in the middle of a cost of living crisis. So can the Chancellor tell the House today, is cutting inheritance tax a decision delayed or a decision abandoned? This autumn statement for growth is now the 11th Conservative economic growth plan, from the 5th Prime Minister, the 7th Chancellor and the 9th Business Secretary. And what do those numbers add up to? According to the most recent GDP data, a big, fat zero. That's zero growth in the most recent data in the third quarter of this year. Now, the Chancellor mentioned some countries that we are outperforming in growth, but I couldn't help notice that he failed to mention any of the many advanced economies that have grown faster than the UK. Over the last 13 years of this low-growth Conservative government, the UK languishes in the bottom third of OECD countries when it comes to growth. There are 27 OECD economies that have grown faster than us in the 13 years since 2010, including the US, Australia, Canada, Sweden, Slovenia and 22 others. In fact, over the next 2 years, no fewer than 177 economies are forecast by the IMF to grow faster.
Sorry.
Don't bother me, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, it bothers me. I'm not being funny. I expect the same courtesies to the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer. Those who wish to not give that courtesy, please go and find something else to do, because my constituents are interested if yours aren't. Rachel Reeves.
And next year, Mr Speaker, we are forecast to be the slowest growing economy in the whole of the G7. When it comes to economic growth, under the Tories, we are more world-following than world-beating. And let's look at how their record on growth compares to Labour's record on growth. Under the Conservatives, GDP growth has averaged 1.5% per year. But with Labour, it grew an average of 2% a year in the 13 years that we were last in office. Had the economy continued to grow at the rate it did with Labour, it would now be £150 billion bigger. So what is this government's economic record? Lower growth and higher borrowing, with debt more than doubling, now at almost 100% of GDP. This is a product of their failures over 13 years. A Tory government that has failed on growth, failed on debt, failed on levelling up and failed on the cost of living too. And now they expect the British people to believe that when they say they are going to turn it all around, when it is them that is the problem and not the solution. Mr Speaker, if we are going to grow the economy, we must get more people into work. Let me be clear. People who can work should work. That's why we've long argued that the work capability assessment needs replacing, because right now it is discouraging people from seeking work. But there's a wider problem that, yet again, this government is failing to face up to. Britain is the only country in the G7 where the employment rate still has not returned to pre-pandemic levels, with the increase in the number of people out of the workforce due to long-term health issues costing the taxpayer a staggering £15.7 billion a year. NHS waiting lists have swelled to 7.8 million, an additional 500,000 since the Prime Minister said he was going to cut them. And 2.6 million people are out of work due to long-term sickness. A healthy nation is critical to a healthy economy. That's why Labour has pledged to cut hospital waiting lists, investing an additional £1.1 billion a year to deliver 2 million more appointments, scans and operations. It will be funded by abolishing the non-dom tax status and replacing it with a modern scheme for people who are genuinely living in the UK for short periods. But once again, we see that this policy has been vetoed by the Prime Minister. Mr Speaker, the best way to get people back to work is to get our NHS working, but the reality is you can never trust the Tories with our NHS. Now, the Chancellor has made a great fanfare about public sector efficiency and value for money. This is from a government that has blown £140 million on a discredited Rwanda scheme and yet are not able to send a single asylum seeker there. £7.2 billion money lost on fraud during the pandemic, all those cheques signed up by the former Chancellor, the current Prime Minister. £8.7 billion on PPE that's been written off. HS2 costing £57 billion with not a single piece of track going north of Birmingham. No one can trust the Tories with taxpayers' money. And it says it all, that after 13 years of Tory government, there are still nearly 12,000 NHS computers running on outdated software that's vulnerable to cyber attacks. 10 years ago, when he was Health Secretary, the now Chancellor promised a paperless NHS by 2018. Yet today, in 2023, 26 NHS trusts are still using fax machines. Now, why on earth should people who experience deteriorating public services under this Conservative government trust them to fix it? When his 6 years as Health Secretary makes him one of the biggest architects of failure. If you put your hands into people's pockets and take money out of them, and they don't see visible improvements in the services that they receive, they get very angry indeed. Not my words, the Chancellor's words 2 years ago. And I agree with him. The Tories have had 13 years to improve public services, and they have failed. Mr. Speaker, this is too little and too late. I do want to welcome the Chancellor's announcement today of additional funding to tackle anti-Semitism and Islamophobia to keep our communities safe, as well as the additional money for the Holocaust Educational Trust. There is no place for hate in our society, and I know that across the House we will work together to eliminate it. Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor calls this an autumn statement for growth, but it is Labour who has led the agenda on growth. And today we see the Conservatives have released their own poor cover version of what we have already announced. The Chancellor today is talking about unlocking capital by reforming pensions. But Labour would go further, encouraging investment into British start-up firms and scale-up firms, and introducing measures to ensure the consolidation of pension funds, so that our pension system gets better returns for savers and for the UK economy. On planning, the Conservatives are following Labour's lead on providing money off bills for communities that host grid infrastructure and speeding up planning decisions. What's taken them so long? Labour will get Britain building again, with a once-in-a-generation set of reforms to accelerate the building of our country's national infrastructure and to build housing too. We will fast-track battery factories, our life sciences and 5G technology to grow our economy and provide good jobs in every part of our country. And we welcome the fact that the Chancellor has announced that he will make full expensing permanent, another thing that we have been calling for. But that doesn't make up for the years of uncertainty that businesses have faced, with taxes going up and down like a yo-yo. With small and medium businesses who play such a pivotal role in growing our economy, left exposed to the Tories' economic volatility. Labour's partnership with business will get our economy firing on all cylinders. That's why this week we established a new British Infrastructure Council with key investors in the UK economy, focused on unlocking private investment by addressing the delivery challenges businesses face when investing in Britain. Through Labour's new National Wealth Fund, we will work alongside the private sector to back the growth of British industries so that we can make the crucial transition to a zero-carbon economy. And for every pound of public investment, we will leverage in 3 times as much private investment, whilst also getting a return to taxpayers. Labour's plan will boost our economy, get debt falling and make working people better off. Now, Mr. Speaker, if you listen to the benches opposite, you would believe that the cost of living crisis was behind us. But inflation is still double the Bank of England's target rate. I know the importance of low and stable inflation from my time as an economist at the Bank of England. Now, it is of course welcome that the Chancellor has accepted this year's recommendations from the Low Pay Commission that we set up on the minimum wage. But the reality is, of the Conservatives' record, the average wages for working people have been held back. Under this government, real average weekly wages have increased by just 3% in 13 years, compared to a 27% increase under the last Labour government, worth an additional £120 more every week for someone going out to work every day. And today, Mr. Speaker, is Equal Pay Day. So it is also important to recognise that the living standards of working women have also been held back by a gender pay gap that I am determined to close. Now, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister say that the cost of living crisis is dealt with. Now, everything might look a little bit better 10,000 feet up in your helicopter. But down here on planet Earth, people are approaching Christmas and the year ahead with worry and trepidation. The cost of living crisis has hit us harder because Tory mismanagement has left us so exposed. 11 million UK households don't have enough savings to cover 3 weeks of living expenses if they needed it. Working families have been skating on thin ice for too long. And as their resilience has been eroded, so has our national economies. Let's not forget, it was this government that oversaw the closure of our critical gas storage facilities, which left our country more exposed to the huge fluctuations in international energy markets. While the former Prime Minister, that's 4 Prime Ministers ago, cut energy efficiency programmes leading to higher bills for homeowners. And just last year, we saw the true cost of the Conservatives when their kamikaze budget crashed the economy, leading to market turmoil, pensions put in peril and a spike in interest rates. 1.6 million families will see their mortgage deals end this year. Those remortgaging since July have seen their payments rocket by an average of £220 a month. And next year, 1.5 million families will face a similar fate. The Conservatives' economic recklessness inflicted a Tory mortgage penalty on families across the country. In Wellingborough, families with a mortgage will be expected to find an additional £190 every single month. In Richmond, North Yorkshire, homeowners face £200 more a month on their mortgage. And in the Chancellor's own constituency, but maybe not for long, families with a mortgage will see an average increase of £420 a month because of this Conservative government's economic failure. And with increased costs for landlords, and the Chancellor knows something about that as well, renters are paying a high price too. The truth is, Mr. Speaker, working people just don't have this sort of money lying around. But this is what we've come to after 13 years of Conservative government. And this is the record upon which people will judge the Conservatives at the next election. This Tory economic recklessness is not a thing of the past. The British people are still paying the price. And we say never again. Last week, Labour put forward an amendment to the King's Speech to put our fiscal lock into law. It would prevent a repeat of last year's economic horror show. And yet the Tories voted against it. It is clear that today, Labour is the party of economic and fiscal responsibility. And what have the Conservatives learnt? The Conservatives have learnt absolutely nothing. Mr. Speaker, the country is crying out for change. A decaying government can change its personnel, but they have failed to change the direction of our country. In 13 years, we've had 7 chancellors. You wouldn't run a business like this. And you can't run a country like it either. And the Prime Minister can't even promise that this Chancellor will be in place at the next election. Now, we've all heard the reports. When they first came together, it was the fairy tale marriage. But 1 year on, the relationship has hit the rocks. The pair have grown apart, with rumours running rife that the Prime Minister already has his eyes on someone else. But whoever this Prime Minister picks as the Chancellor, the truth is this: Britain is and will be worse off under the Conservatives. They have held back growth. They have crashed our economy, increased debt, trashed our public services, left businesses out in the cold and made life harder for working people. Our country cannot afford 5 more years of the Conservatives. Mr. Speaker, the Ravens are leaving the tower when even Saatchi and Saatchi are saying the Tories are not working. And the questions that people will be asking at the next election and after today's autumn statements are simple. Do me and my family feel better off after 13 years of Conservative government? Do our schools, our hospitals, our police, do they work better after 13 years of Conservative government? In fact, does anything in Britain work better today than when the Conservatives came into office 13 years ago? We all know that working people are worse off under the Conservatives, with growth down, mortgages up, prices up, taxes up, debt up, and, Mr. Speaker, their time is up. It is time for change, a changed Labour Party to lead Britain and to make working people better off.
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, has just sat down after delivering her response to the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, who is now responding to her. But before that, in an hour-long, almost an hour-long speech, he outlined big changes, he said, to business and, of course, as expected, those cuts to national insurance. The surprise, if you like, is that he cut national insurance by more than we had thought. He said it's a turning point in the economy, and that allowed him to actually introduce these tax cuts. And they are coming in, some of them, in January, not next April, as we might have expected. So let's outline a couple of them. In national insurance, there is the cut of 2% from the 12% main employee national insurance rate, which Jeremy Hunt says will help 27 million people and save those on an average income of £35,000 a year about £450. And he said, I can deliver that tax cut responsibly and without fuelling inflation because the Office for Budget Responsibility has said so. He then went on to the cuts for national insurance for self-employed. Class 2, they're called national insurance flat rate. It's been abolished. That will save a certain amount of money combined with what they call a Class 4 national insurance rate would save £350 a year for about 2 million self-employed. This was announced against a backdrop of figures on growth, which were significantly downgraded this year, next year and the year after. But he said that the government was going for growth, and they were doing so by what he terms as many supply-side reforms, including all sorts of measures to boost business. The OBR, he said, will contribute £20 billion a year in business investment. Well, I'm happy to say we have a Treasury Minister here with us to discuss all that. Gareth Davis, welcome to you. About £10 billion worth of tax cuts, which I have broadly outlined. But do you accept, overall, you're still raising taxes?
Well, thank you for having me on your show. I think that today was an autumn statement for growth, and it had three major components. The first is to reward work, and that's by cutting national insurance contributions for both employees and for the self-employed. We're also making sure that work pays by raising the national living wage to £11.44. That is the largest rise in the national living wage. We're boosting investment, as you say, by some £20 billion, which is the key aspect to getting growth motoring in this country. And we're supporting the vulnerable by upgrading pensions, by earnings and benefits by 6.7%.
But overall, are you still raising taxes?
So we have brought 3 million people out of paying any tax at all since 2010.
But the answer is yes, isn't it?
And what we have had to do in the period since, particularly from the pandemic, is make really difficult decisions. We've cut significant taxes today. We'd like to go further in the future, but we still have to make sure that we're managing the finances responsibly. You know, inflation is still, it's down significantly, but it's still too high, and we want to ensure that we keep paying down our debt.
Right. I mean, as I said, let's just show you this graph because it comes from one of the books we've got here on our desks in the studio. It's from the Office for Budget Responsibility, and you can see here the lines towards the end. It's a little bit complicated, but you can still see the trajectory is still upwards when you look at taxes as a share of GDP. They are going up, and they are going up significantly. The Institute for Fiscal Studies have said that in total you've raised taxes overall by £100 billion a year, and that's just since the last election. You've announced something in the region of £10 billion of tax cuts. But in the end, it's a drop in the ocean.
If you look at where we're cutting tax to reward work and stimulate growth. So if you actually look at what we're trying to achieve with this budget, we're trying to achieve strong economic growth over a sustained long-term period of time. And as I say, reward work by cutting the national insurance contributions, while also being able to make sure work pays. So if you just look at where we're cutting tax, you understand our approach and our strategy for the British people.
But you also have to admit that you have increased taxes. You aren't the party of low taxation. You're the party of high taxation. And we've seen it right across this Parliament. It would just be good to hear a minister in the Treasury say, you're right.
Well, we completely accept that on the back of two global shocks in this Parliament, so COVID, which we provided £400 billion of support for families and businesses throughout the country, and energy support of £94 billion, we believe in paying back our debt. We make no apology for it, and that requires yes, raising revenue and making really difficult decisions on spending.
Right.
And that's why you're seeing debt come down.
So how can we afford these tax cuts then?
Well, we can afford these tax cuts for two main reasons. One is that we've reached our commitment to halve inflation by the end of this year. So as you saw last week, it came down by
prices are still going up. They're just going up less quickly.
And this is why we can't go as far as we absolutely want to, because the Bank of England still has a target of 2%. 4.6% is half of what it was at the peak, but we still have further to go, and we completely accept that.
Right.
The second reason...
Yeah, go on then, the second reason, sorry.
The second reason is we do need to ensure that we are paying down our debt, that we continue to make very difficult decisions. And that will continue because we manage our finances responsibly. What we're not going to do is make massive commitments, like, for example, the Labour Party, who want to add £28 billion to our debt for green initiatives that they haven't actually described the detail on. We're not going to do that. We're going to cut taxes to grow the economy, to reward work, and keep focusing on getting inflation down.
Right.
The OBR have said this package will not be inflationary. They've said it is the biggest upgrade to growth as a result of measures that they have ever scored.
Right. You mentioned debt. How much is the government currently spending on debt interest payments?
Too much. It's, I think, over 100 billion pounds.
Actually, it came in at 97 billion pounds. But when your government came to power back in 2010, yes, you can have that 3 billion on me. Back in 2010, the bill was just 40 billion. It was £40 billion in 2010. It's now £97 billion. So it's soared under the Conservatives.
It is way too high, but it is because we stepped in with significant support during COVID. As I said, £400 billion. Furlough scheme allowed us to grow out of the economy quicker than most G7 countries because we put in place.
So how can you afford tax cuts?
Because we do have headroom. We have £13 billion of headroom, but that is low by historical standards. What we have decided to do is use some of the amount of money that we have available to us to stimulate, no, we haven't spent all of it, to stimulate economic growth and to reward work. That is what we're...
Why didn't you pay down the deficit, more of the deficit?
Well, we are continuing to make very difficult decisions. We'd like to go further on tax cuts, for example, to stimulate even more growth. But we continue to have a balanced approach.
Right.
Debt is coming down significantly. You heard the Chancellor say that debt is coming down from 100% to 94% over the OBR score period. That is a significant drop in debt.
That question around headroom, just looking as we all are at the moment, just to explain to our viewers the various documents that come out in the context of an event like this, the Office for Budget Responsibilities numbers. On that headroom figure, I think you quoted there of £13 billion, they say that number again incorporates the extra revenue anticipated from increasing fuel duty rates, which traditionally you guys have tended to freeze, which suggests, doesn't it, that it's a kind of illusory number, really?
Well, you have to take that with the OBR. They are the ones that independently score and forecast. But what we are doing is working off the OBR forecast and scoring. And as I say...
Well, you're either committed to putting up fuel duty in line with inflation in the next few years, or you're not. Because if you are, you've got the number. And if you're not, you haven't.
Well, we've made no announcement on fuel duty today. But what we have done is cut taxes for working people with a national insurance cut and the self-employed. And we're continuing to focus on growing our economy by stimulating business investment, which will be transformative.
But in the end, just before I come to you, in the end, it is about how people feel. Absolutely. Will they feel better off? This is the Office for Budget Responsibility. In a tweet, living standards are forecast to be 3.5% lower in 24-25 than pre-pandemic. This would be the largest reduction in living standards since records began in the 1950s, but only half the fall we expected in March. So the fall is less. It's still the largest reduction in living standards since records began. Is that a record you're proud of?
Well, people have gone through an incredibly difficult time with extremely high inflation. We have stepped in, as I say, with significant support. This statement steps in with a pay rise for millions of people. 3 million people will see a rise in their income, £1,800 on average over the year. We've upgraded the local housing allowance. We're upgrading benefits by 6.7%, and pensioners are seeing their pensions rise by 8.5%. So
they will
be
welcomed.
Doing what we can do in a responsible way, which balances all of these different factors, getting our debt down, controlling inflation, and growing our economy. And that's what we'll continue to do.
Faisal?
So, Minister, you recognise that next year growth is lower than forecast in March and inflation is higher. Those are the two key metrics of the economy. I'm sure you do. That's what it says in the OBR document.
The OBR have made very clear that the package today has no impact on inflation. They are not inflation. We have always been consistent.
But in terms of the economic
we've always been consistent. We would not cut taxes.
Well, let's take up that tax cut thing, because actually for the first time the OBR has reassessed the income tax threshold measure. Originally, when Rishi Sunak introduced that, it was going to raise several £billion, the freezing of the thresholds. Now, having expanded, extended and hit super high inflation, it's going to raise £44.6 billion by 2028-29 in 1 year. So this is not a tax cut, is it? You've taken the taxes via thresholds in a sort of stealthy way that people don't notice as much. And then you've given a little bit back in the form of national insurance, and you want loads of credit for that.
Well, you referenced the freezing of thresholds. That was in 2021 on the back of a pandemic where we spent £400 billion supporting families and businesses. And yes, we need to pay that debt down. So we have to take very difficult decisions. We'd like to go further in our
Why don't you
tax
unfreeze
cuts.
them?
But what we are doing is we're focusing on national insurance contributions, which focuses on work. We want to reward work. Income tax includes lots of different types of income, such as dividends and other. We are focusing on national insurance contributions for employees because that absolutely focuses on rewarding work.
I don't say why wouldn't increasing the thresholds reward work? Because so many people have been dragged into a higher tax band. You know, they're paying more tax on their income. Why wouldn't that reward work? And that would reverse the freezing of tax thresholds, which has brought in so much money because of inflation.
Because that includes not just earnings from work, it can include earnings from dividends and other areas of income. What we want to do with this package is reward specifically work.
And that's what national percent of it, or 95% of it, is from people's income from work, isn't it?
And I don't recognise those figures, but national insurance, what is indisputable is that national insurance contributions for self-employed and employees focuses on those in work, but not income from other means of income. And
if you had raised thresholds anywhere near in line with inflation, people would be talking about a genuine tax cut. This looks entirely cosmetic as a token, when in fact, actually, as Faisal was saying, it's £45 billion a year extra in tax by the end of this period.
That is not something I accept. I think this is a significant tax cut for those in work. Those self-employed, we're abolishing one of the taxes. We're cutting it from 9 to 8% for other self-employed people.
Yes,
to walk through just some of those numbers, just from the conversation of the last couple of minutes, looking at the Office for Budget Responsibility document, saying that the tax changes in this autumn statement reduce the tax burden by 0.7% of GDP, but it still rises in every year to a post-war high of 37.7% by 2028-29.
So that figure doesn't change, does it?
And then just a couple of other numbers. By 28-29, those frozen thresholds, these thresholds that we're talking about at the moment, this concept of fiscal drag as it's known, result in nearly 4 million additional workers paying income tax, 3 million moving into the higher rate, 400,000 into the additional rate.
Gareth?
You're taking this whole discussion is focused on you picking a point in time since 2010.
It's about us reading the Office for Budget Responsibility.
You're reading it brilliantly, but you are picking. It is a fact. You're doing very well at reading out, but it is a fact that you're picking a point in time, which is 2021, where we made a really difficult decision to freeze the thresholds. I take another period of time, which is since 2010, we've brought 3 million people out of paying any tax whatsoever. In this country, you can now earn, thanks to this Conservative government, £1,000 a month because you pay no tax. You are not included.
Because inflation, so
right, but
3 million people are paying no tax in our country thanks to the change
It's a roller coaster, isn't it? It's something like 66% of people of adults were taxpayers, and by the end of this process, according to the IFS, it will be 66% again.
And actually, the sort of conclusion from what Chris has just read from there is that what the OBR is saying is that everything that has been spelt out and outlined today, still there will be a record tax burden. The tax burden will be at a record high, despite everything you've announced, and I take your point about the cuts in national insurance and what that could mean. But when you step back, the tax burden will still be at a record high, and you accept that.
Well, I'll repeat what I said earlier. People don't like to talk about this anymore in the press, but we had a once-in-a-generation... Hang on, let me just finish, because it is important. We had a once-in-a-generation global pandemic. In that time, we stepped in with £400 billion of support. The measures that we introduced cost a lot, and it increased our debt to a significant level. Absolutely. We make no apology for supporting families and businesses and the most vulnerable through a global pandemic. That needs paying back. We believe in paying back our debt. When the global energy prices spiked, we stepped in and paid half of people's energy bills. And I came on shows like this and I was interviewed saying, what are you going to do to support people with, look at this graph on wholesale gas prices. Well, we stepped in and paid half of people's bills. That costs money. But we also believe in sustainable public finances, which means paying that back. And I'm afraid that means taking really difficult decisions on spending. And it also means making really difficult decisions. It means making difficult decisions on taxes. Today, we are showing the British public that we want to cut taxes. We are significantly cutting taxes. We want to go further, but we're not going to do anything that is both inflationary or puts public finances in jeopardy.
And all we're asking are about the political choices, because you could have done other things. Yes, we haven't forgotten about the pandemic or the war in Ukraine. Growth has been higher since just before the pandemic. It is all about where you take your starting date from in other comparable countries than here. But if you think about the other choices would have been perhaps to reduce borrowing. I think, actually, Jeremy Hunt was quoting again Nigel Lawson, Margaret Thatcher's Chancellor. He did say over the weekend that says extra borrowing always means extra taxes in the future. So you will have to raise taxes later to pay for the taxes you've cut today.
Not if we stimulate significant growth in our economy. Yeah, and that's why business investment, unlocking business investment will both boost employment, will bring investment, FDI, the reforms that we've made to FDI, the planning and grids reforms, all of these things, the capital allowances, which all the major business investment bodies asked for. Their number one ask was make full expensing permanent. We're doing all of that. And, you know, just the full expensing alone, the OBR forecast that will bring in £14 billion, £3 billion a year in forecast.
Simon?
Yes, I'm just going to range on that. In the OBR book, it says, actually, as a result of making this permanent, they expect lower investment in the short term, because obviously people wanted to invest before it expired. So you're actually going to see lower investment in the next 2 years. They do admit it'll be higher in last years, but the question they question about whether it works or not. They say of the £10.9 billion cost of this tax cut in 2028-29. 9.2 billion derives from the static costing. This is investment that would have happened anyway, and only 1.8 billion of the cost is because of extra investment that this very measure has stimulated. So in a way, the OBR is saying it's a very expensive policy and it's questionable whether it works or not. They've put it under the highly sensitive or highly uncertain category of tax cuts. You're putting a lot of weight on this.
Well, it's what industry has asked for by a disproportionate amount. We know that it will stimulate increased investment. Forecasts are forecasts, but we know that this is part of a broader package. There's 120 different measures. Yes, it's a massive, significant part of our tax offer. By the way, we're also freezing business rates for small business as well. So we are looking to boost investment through tax measures, but also non-tax measures, such as the planning, the grids, the energy companies that want to come here and connect to the grid. We're making that a lot easier. And so do you think this is all part of a big package?
And just on that planning thing, I think what you're saying is you're going to give £10,000 over 10 years to people affected by energy infrastructure, which is very close to them. And that you think you can cut the planning time for some of the offshore wind, for example, from 15 to 7 years, as per the Nick Windsor report. Many governments, local and national, have foundered on the rocks of thinking that they can change the planning rules. Do you think £10,000 bribe is going to do it?
Well, the principle behind it is that if you are willing to host, if you are able to host, willing to host nationally significant infrastructure that will benefit the whole country, we believe that you should benefit too. And so the community benefit aspect is absolutely right, in my view. Yes.
And thank you for staying with us so long. There are just two more things, Gareth Davis, that I want to show you. This is, if you like, the visual graph of what Chris was explaining earlier. Tax as a percentage of GDP. We showed it before the autumn statement. You can see there the dotted line at the end. That projection is still pretty well the same. The new figure, it's 37.7%, that record high from the Office for Budget Responsibility. And when we come back to the issue of choices, of course, you could have used some of the, what we broadly call headroom, to put into public services, for example. I think, Faisal, you have something...
The OBR has just said that if you were to spend the same inflation-adjusted on public services, you'd have allocated another £19 billion to them just to keep the services going with the prices having gone up so much. But the Chancellor has just added £4 billion a year in cash terms. That means a squeeze on public services at a time when many of our viewers will be saying, well, public services don't seem to be in the smartest nick. Let's put it like that.
Well, what I respond to that is, as the Chancellor pointed out, in real terms, spending on public services is going up by some £85 billion in real terms.
Acknowledge it's a squeeze in real terms.
And it's an £85 billion increase in public services over the period. But we do want our public services to work better as well, and that's why we've got a productivity review. Sorry, Joe.
Yeah, no, carry on.
So that's my response to that, which is we are seeing a real terms increase in public spending. We have decided with this autumn statement to focus on growth, and we make no apologies for that. We want to reward work and we want to stimulate growth.
We have to let you go. Thank you very much, Gareth Davis from the Treasury Minister there, for joining us. In a moment, we're going to speak to Darren Jones, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. But before that, let me just remind everyone of the key measures that were announced by Jeremy Hunt in that autumn statement. The headline, National Insurance cut 2%, not just 1%, as we were perhaps expecting, from 12 to 10, and that is from January the 6th. The minimum wage, which we knew about, to increase to £11.44 per hour from April for workers aged 21 and over. As Simon was saying earlier, that's come down to a lower age. Mandatory work placements for job seekers who have not found work after 18 months. And I think if they don't accept something that's offered to them after a further 6 months, then their benefits, or their case, will be closed and their benefits will be stopped. We're also going to say goodbye to Chris Mason, the BBC's political editor, and be joined by Vicky Young, who is the deputy political editor. The key measures here: state pension to increase by 8.5% to £221.20 a week from April. It was one of those things that was discussed, a straw man, if you like, but in the end, the state pension is rising by the highest figure available from September, and that is 8.5%. That will be expensive. Universal credit and other benefits will be increased from April by 6.7%. As usual, the September figure higher than the October one. Local housing allowance rate to increase to the 30th percentile of local market rents. That will be welcomed. And all alcohol duty, yes, well, many people will be raising a glass to this, will be frozen until August the 1st next year, not least the hospitality industry. 75% of business rates discount for retail, hospitality and leisure businesses, extended for another year. And then the national insurance cut for the self-employed, what's called Class 2 national insurance contributions, they're abolished. Full expensing. And it is a big tax break. Jeremy Hunt said it is the most, I think, the largest in history in terms of business taxes. Tax break for businesses to deduct spending on investment made permanent, and 4 additional investment zones across England and Wales. So, as expected, an awful lot of things included. New rules to encourage local authorities to fast-track business planning applications, to speed up business, in some ways an answer to Keir Starmer's conference speech about being the builders. £450 million to the local authority housing fund to deliver 2,400 new homes. Consultation on allowing any house to be converted into 2 flats, and up to £10,000 off electricity bills over 10 years for those living closest to new power lines, some sort of incentive there for people. So those are some, or certainly an awful lot, of the key measures. Let's welcome Darren Jones, Chief Secretary to the Treasury. We often hear from Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer. They say they want taxes on working people to come down. Well, they have. You must be delighted.
We welcome them, but a couple of £100 off a year, when on average families are paying £4,000 more a year under the Tories, doesn't go anywhere near enough. And the reason for that is because the Tories have failed to grow the economy. They've been borrowing to cover up their inability to pay the bills every month for years and years and years. And the economy is in a bad state. I mean, Jeremy Hunt said to us today that everything was looking good, but on growth it's projected to be 0%. Inflation's projected to be higher over the coming years than it had been previously, and the tax burden is still the highest it has been on people since the Second World War. That doesn't seem pretty good to me.
Right, because Keir Starmer again tweeting today, criticising the government along the same lines by saying that we've had 25 tax rises under the Tories. Which of those 25 Tory tax rises would you cut?
Well, in terms of what we would do in government, we've got to see where we get to at the point of the next election, because today Jeremy Hunt seems to have spent a pretty big chunk of what he described as his fiscal headroom, the cash down the back of the sofa. In a normal time, you would expect 20 to 30 billion quid to be saved for things coming up in the future, and he's not had that much for quite some time.
Right, but you're obviously unhappy with the huge number, as you see it, of tax rises and the tax burden as a percentage of GDP, which is going to be extremely high. We've discussed that with Gareth Davis. But what would you do? Would you cut taxes more if you had been delivering the autumn statement today?
So we can only cut taxes when we can afford to do so. The fact is the Conservatives have got the economy to a position where there is very, very little money to play with. So we need to do a couple of things, which we've been talking about in the Labour Party.
Do you think they were affordable today, these tax cuts?
We're doing the maths now on adding it all up.
But you welcome them?
Everything I heard today we welcome, but we've got to check the maths, because they've got a habit in the Tory party of doing unfunded announcements.
Never happens in the Labour Party, of course.
Well, not under Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves it doesn't, and we've been very, very clear on that. But you're only going to get to a position where you can afford to give further tax cuts to people, which we would like to see in the years ahead, if you get the economy growing and you improve the productivity in the public sector, which the Tories have failed to do over the last 13 years.
Is there just one tax cut that you could give us today that you'd like to see? The Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, you're very unhappy with the tax rises. There must be one tax cut that you're looking at.
You've asked me that question before, and I'm going to give you the same answer, which is it would be irresponsible of me at this point in time to start announcing tax cuts when we don't even have the final books before the next election, let alone seeing the books if we come into government at the
I'll ask you a broader question then, because I would hate to repeat myself, Darren. Will the overall tax level be higher or lower under a Labour government?
So we want it to come down, but of course we're going to inherit the position if we win the next election.
So just to remind people, this is what it is, or projected to be, tax as a percentage of GDP. Will it be lower than that or higher than that?
Well, at the point of the next election, it might be even higher because of the next budget we've got from the Conservatives in March next year. And that's why I can't answer on specific numbers today, because who knows what they will do over the next 12 months before the election. But we do want the tax burden to come down on working people over the course of the next Parliament if we win the next.
But we do know a couple of tax rises that you want. You want to scrap the non-dom status, and you want to put VAT on private school fees. So actually they will go up, won't they?
Well, there's a couple of loopholes that we're closing. So one loophole on non-doms is if you're working here, you should pay your tax here. They get loopholes at the moment. We're going to close those and put that money into the National Health Service and in our schools. Private schools had a loophole where they didn't have to pay VAT, even though they operate as private companies. We will close that and put that money into the education system. And there was a third loophole as well, which is for private equity bosses, where they get charged corporate gains tax, not income tax on their earnings. And we would close that loophole as well. We think those are three tax loophole changes that are appropriate.
Or rises. I mean, if we look at that 28-29 figure, first Labour budget, let's say, after an election, will you commit to it? Let's say, I don't know how long it will be, because we don't know when the election is going to be. Will the tax burden be higher or low? Would you like it to be by 28-29?
You're still asking me the same question in a slightly different way. But my answer is the same.
But you want them to go down, so why can't you say, yes, I'll commit to by 28-29 it'll be lower?
What the weather's going to be in 2028? I mean, you have to wait until
forecasts
you've
are
got
for. That's what all these...
And forecasts are often wrong, and that's why you've got to carry your umbrella with you, because it's often raining when you're told
all right,
it's not.
Just before I open it up to our other guests, let's look at it through the other end of the lens, because we've talked about, as you say, tax rises, or you want the burden to be lower. But why don't you increase taxes? Why don't you be proud of increasing taxes and putting that money into public services?
because our public services are on their knees.
Yeah, so?
But they're spending quite a lot of money. You look at the National Health Service today. Jeremy Hunt said today we've increased money into the health service. And do you know what? They have, in cash terms, put more money into the NHS. They've employed more doctors, but they're getting through fewer patients. So there's a huge question here about how we spend taxpayers' money more effectively in modernising and reforming our public services. You can't just keep throwing cash at a broken system. You've got to get in there and do the hard work to fix our public services.
You don't think that the NHS needs more cash?
I think the NHS needs reform, and I think we can help it spend its money more effectively. And I know Wes Streeting, my colleague running the health team, thinks that very, very strongly.
With respect, I mean, we're within a year from election.
A couple of,
a couple of years ago, you might have gotten away with saying, "Oh, let's just see what the next couple of fiscal events said." We're within a year. People want to know your instincts here. You've said that taxes are too high, which suggests that they should be lower. You've said that some areas of spending are on their knees, which suggests that that should be higher. You're also going to borrow more to invest. This is not a recipe. Something's got to give there. What's going to give? Give us a sense of where your priorities lie.
Sure. So you use the word instincts, and I'll give you the answers about our instincts. But no party would set out this far away from a general election when you've still got another budget coming in March, the final fully costed economic picture in the manifesto.
Gordon Brown followed Tory spending plans. You can tell us that.
He did that very close to the election, didn't he? He didn't do it a year out from the election.
So it's clearly what you're going to do.
It's
clearly the political tactic.
He didn't do it. He didn't do it. But let me tell you my instincts, because I've already told you. We do want to see the tax burden coming down on working people. We do want to get the economy growing. We need to get national debt down as a percentage of the size of the economy. And we need to fix our public services.
£44 billion tax rise. Unfreeze those thresholds?
So we have said that this fiscal drag has been a huge burden on working families across this country, which is why we want to reduce that burden.
But I'm not doing anything about it.
I'm not going to announce tax policy today in advance of what I hope will be a very good first Labour budget at some point in the next 18 months.
Right. I mean, Keir Starmer promised to raise income tax on high earners or higher earners, specifically when he ran to be the leader of the Labour Party. He's now said that he's not going to do that. But people might think, well, our public services are on our knees. Why not?
Well, so we're not raising income tax rates.
Why?
But because there's a lot of money going into the system. I say, people at home, I think, are happy to pay their taxes for a health system and the schools, but they want to make sure that money's being spent effectively, and they know at the moment that it's not. So how we fix our public services has to be at the heart of how we get the economy.
Well, you say that about people, but let's have a look at where the UK actually sits in terms of the amount of tax we pay as a percentage of GDP compared to other countries. Look at Canada, Germany, Italy and France at 53%. Compared to those countries, tax isn't that high compared to them and the amount of money they spend on public services, particularly health.
Sure. I mean, I see that, but we're not France, we're not Italy, we're not Germany.
Well, no, but
we think we can turn the economy around through proper approaches to economic growth, which the Tories have failed to do over the past 13 years. And quite frankly, the Conservatives haven't been interested in fixing our public services. They don't really mind that you can't get a dentist appointment, that you can't get seen in the health service.
But you can't say they haven't put cash in, because they put record amounts of cash in.
But it's not just about money, it's about money and reform. And there are some hard choices about that.
Yes, but what's wrong with being a bit more like Germany and France and Canada when it comes to tax levels?
Well, I don't know what they spend their money on in those countries, but I don't think we should aspire to being an even higher tax take country when nothing is working.
But growth has also been higher in quite a few of those countries.
I think that's for different reasons. I don't think that's because of tax. I think it's because of things like industrial policy, which is why I say time and time again, it's not just about the money you spend, it's how you run the country, how you reform your public services, how you engage with business. And after 13 years on all of those measures, the Tories have failed. The budget today, the autumn statement today, will not do anywhere near enough to turn that around.
Darren Jones, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to Vicky Young, the BBC's Deputy Political Editor. What do you make of what you've heard, both from the Treasury Minister, Gareth Davis, and Darren Jones?
It's really hard to look at this without thinking about when the election's going to be. I know everyone thinks that in Westminster we're obsessed with it. It's certainly what Conservative MPs are pretty obsessed with. And what they were looking at today was, could Jeremy Hunt say anything that's going to move the dial, really, in terms of they feel that Rishi Sunak has tried to pull lots of different levers. They haven't necessarily worked. They look to a year ago when we were sitting here on that day and what was going on then. They do think that he's steadied the ship. But what they're looking for now is something about can they go out onto the doorsteps and sell something to people and sell it to voters. And I think, the problem they've got, one Tory MP said to me yesterday, their fear is that he could announce almost anything, and they talk about Ken Clarke in 1996. He cut the income tax rate by
Well, he always said he delivered
penny.
a benign economy to Labour.
And they say, actually, their worry is that no matter what Jeremy Hunt says now or in the budget, that people maybe aren't listening anymore. I thought it was interesting that Jeremy Hunt used the phrase compassionate conservatism. I think he's trying to show that there's economic competence, after a time when lots of people would say that there hasn't been. But in the end, he's got to get over the fact that people will be looking at this and thinking, not am I better off than I was 1 year ago, am I better off than I was 5 years ago, 10 years ago even.
And we just obviously had the figures from the OBR in terms of living standards. Let's welcome Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Welcome to you. You've obviously had some sight of the books in front of you.
I've had hours to read.
That's why I said some sight. In terms of, first of all, the national insurance cut, it was bigger than we thought, 1%. It was 2%. We had the Treasury Minister saying that they are wanting to put more money in people's pockets because of the cost of living. But in terms of the overall tax burden, the overall tax take, what difference will it make?
Well, I think 2 or 3 things there. The first is I think if you're going to cut a main tax rate, national insurance is probably a better thing to do than income tax. That helps low-earning people in work. But the overall effect, of course, of the tax changes that we've seen, particularly the freezing of income tax thresholds and allowances, is that for most people this is still going to be a tax rise when you put all of them together. And indeed, in the long run, this 2p off national insurance doesn't even undo the effect of greater inflation that we're going to see over the next 3 or 4 years in terms of the fiscal drag that is now in the system.
He said he could do it responsibly, give these tax cuts, and that they wouldn't be inflationary. He said the OBR had, in a word, given him permission to do so. Do you agree with that, broadly?
Well, these are relatively small numbers in the £2.5 trillion economy. So will they be inflationary? If they're going to push in any direction, they're going to push towards being slightly inflationary. But overall, I doubt the Bank of England is going to be desperately worried. But they take risks on that side rather than on the other side.
Right. Fiscal drag. Can you explain it for us so that everyone understands it? Because we use this term, we band it about, we talk about freezing tax thresholds. What does it mean in reality?
So when inflation is high, when earnings and incomes are rising, if you keep at the same point in cash terms where you start to pay income tax, you drag more of your income into tax. So suppose the tax allowance is about £12,500. Suppose you earn, say, £22,500, you're paying tax on £10,000. Then you've got a pay rise, you're paying tax on more of your income. And if that tax threshold stays the same, that means you pay tax on a greater fraction of your income. What should happen, what normally happens, is that those tax thresholds rise with prices, but the government has frozen them for 6 years, and the OBR now thinks this is a much more than £50 billion tax rise. That's an enormous tax rise.
Right, and when we also look at spending, it's interesting that before the autumn statement, the state is bigger than perhaps Conservative governments might have planned in the past. We had the Treasury Minister sitting there, Gareth Davies, saying we want growth in the economy. We think that the measures for business will boost that. And then you look at the forecast, it's been downgraded quite significantly, growth for this year, next year and the year after.
Yeah, it looks like the OBR's expecting the size of the economy to be about where it was expecting in March. It's just a different path. Actually, the economy grew. It started at a high level. The base statistics were wrong. The economy was bigger than we thought. And we haven't had a sort of recession this year, which the OBR thought we might have back in March. But then from here on, the growth looks pretty feeble. It really does still look pretty feeble. And whilst the Chancellor said that overall the economy is bigger now than it was pre-pandemic, actually, if you look at that, the size of the economy per person, it's still no bigger than it was pre-pandemic.
Can I get you, I'll come to you, Simon, in just a moment. You tweeted this. Chancellor just announced a long-term cash freeze in investment spending. That's a significant real cut, of course. We already have public sector investment well below that in most comparable countries. This is not good for growth. What is that long-term cash freeze in investment spending?
Well, so in March already, the Chancellor said we're just going to keep stable in cash terms the amount we spend on investment, on infrastructure spending and so on. He's extended that for another year, and of course that means in real terms it's going down, and there's a fraction of national income that's going down even faster. Now, to be fair to the government, they have actually brought it up quite a lot over the last 5 or 6 years, starting with Philip Hammond. Over the last 5 or 6 years, they have invested quite a lot, but this is quite a significant cut over the next 5 years in real terms. And if there's one thing we're pretty confident of in terms of what matters for growth, it is investing in our roads and our infrastructure and other and those sorts of things.
What do you make then of the government's criticism of Labour wanting to borrow an extra £20 billion a year if they win the election on green policies, but on this debate on borrowing and whether it's a good or a bad thing?
Well, of course, I mean, the government has chosen, today, actually not to bring borrowing down as much as they could have done. Had they sort of essentially done nothing today, then borrowing would have come down a little bit more. And borrowing is actually coming down to very low levels. The real problem here is that debt is high. Debt interest payments are incredibly high. And that means that within a year or two, the government's going to be taking more out of the economy than it's going to be spending on stuff, because it's going to be spending so much on debt interest that for the first time in 25 years, actually, we're going to be running what's called a primary surplus. In other words, bringing in more in revenue than we're spending on things other than debt interest. And even so, debt is still essentially flat over this period. I think that really kind of illustrates the huge challenge that we've got here. Very high levels of tax, and highest historically that we've had, and yet apparently not very much for public services, partly because we are just spending so much on that debt interest.
The single biggest ticket item in the whole thing was the full expensing of business investment, and it's going to cost about £11 billion a year by 2028, 2029, and the Chancellor said that's going to generate business investment of £3 billion a year. What did you make of the maths that the OBR came up? Was that a good use of money?
Well, I think, given that we had this full expensing introduced for 3 years back in March, I think everyone thinks it makes no sense to have it temporarily. It's something you would want permanently. And the second thing to say is it's much, much cheaper than that in the long run. So once you get 7, 8 years down the road, we think it's only going to cost a couple of £2 billion a year. So
because you've got higher GDP, you've got higher growth, you've got higher tax receipts?
No, more because of the way that corporation tax works at the moment. If you're a company now investing stuff, then your corporation tax bill goes down over time. Whereas if you bring this full expensing in, you lose the corporation tax immediately. Right. So in a way, as a pre-election sort of budget or autumn statement, that was quite a statement, because I don't think many people are going to vote on the basis of that. It costs quite a lot in the short run, but the expectation it's valuable in the long run. So I think there's not all of this autumn statement by any means was just a sort of pre-election bribe. There's real stuff in here which is genuinely, I think, aimed at getting the economy growing.
And so, I mean, do you think overall, when you net off the national insurance cut bigger than expected from, say, the tax threshold fiscal drag point that you made, in this current year that's coming up, is that still a net tax cut or next cut?
Well, it depends what you're comparing with what.
Right,
but so for if you compare sort of 2021 to next fiscal year, if you're on average earnings, you're probably a little bit better off. But if you're on below or above average earnings, you're going to be worse off. If you're comparing this year to next, then for most people, the value of the national insurance cut is more than just this 1 year's fall in the real value of the thresholds. But pretty much everyone's going to be paying more tax at the end of this Parliament than they were at the beginning of this Parliament.
On your point about not everything was done with a sort of pre-election hat on, pensions, the announcement on pensions that you will be able to sort of transfer cash in, that sounded like quite a positive note for employees.
A positive note for employees who are able to use it. I mean, I think this is something that's going to worry employers, though, because this is going to be quite an expensive thing to do. And I think it may well... absolutely, we want a system where individuals keep a single pot and don't end up at retirement with 15 different pots. The real issue here is how you're going to make this work, because at the moment, if you've got a group of relatively low paid employees, as an employee, you can probably negotiate quite a good deal with a pension provider. If you've got lots of turnover and end up with 10 different pension providers, you may end up on average with a less good deal, and that's the thing that we really need to sort out, I think.
Vicky?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about something that we've talked about before, about the NHS, actually, and about productivity in public services. We had a lot there, didn't we, from Jeremy Hunt, about how, as you say, there is money going in, but the productivity doesn't seem to be improving. And I think you pointed to something before about the workforce in the NHS, that there have been more people recruited, and yet the number of people being treated doesn't seem to be going up. And that seems to be a really sort of big problem, I think, not for just this government, whoever does become the next government, and what they do about it. I just feel like we've heard so much about productivity in public services, and yet it doesn't ever seem to improve. Was there anything you heard today which you thought might do anything about that?
Well, we didn't hear any details on what might happen to improve productivity in the NHS. I mean, it's one of the puzzles, actually. Productivity in the NHS was rising through the 2010s. I mean, over the between 2010 and 2019, there's a bit more money, but actually quite a lot more activity. Since 2019, quite a lot more money and no more activity. And it seems to be that there seem to be issues like this around the world, but it may be because there are still some people in COVID beds, and that creates problems in terms of isolating. It may be that staff are somewhat disengaged. It may be that there's a problem with getting people out the other end into social care. I mean, there's probably a lot of those things, but these are all hypotheses. And I think the surprising thing, in a way, is I don't think we have a definite answer to kind of what role each of those plays. And there's an opportunity here. I mean, it really ought to be possible to regain that trend that we were on pre-2019, but we're not there yet.
Paul,
just a very quick one. Just going back to Joe's original point in the graph, we were talking about the overall tax burden, or the tax take as a percentage of national income. Should we get used to, with an ageing population, that is going to be very, very hard to shift, come what may, and that it is naive to expect that to come down to levels that we saw 5-10 years ago?
I fear it is. I mean, actually, most of my life, which is now getting quite long, taxes have been about 33-34% of national income. They've shot up, and they're shooting up over this decade to 37-38%. My guess is that they'll stay there for the remainder of my life.
Something to be joyful about.
But for example, the triple lock, they ran up, they sort of ran something up the flagpole saying maybe we'll uprate pensions by the lower amount rather than the higher amount, only to sort of backtrack on that and say, don't worry everyone, it's triple lock all the way as you've known it. But presumably at some point that has to be a live discussion.
Well, at some point. I mean, actually, it's health and care more than pensions that are really putting the pressure on public finances. But clearly, if you carry on with the triple lock, that's going to become more expensive over time. But more expensive in a sort of random way. We don't quite know how much the triple lock is going to cost, because we don't quite know what the relationship between incomes and earnings would be. The interesting thing, if we'd had the triple lock in the 20 years up to 2008, it would have cost almost nothing, because every year you had earnings above inflation. If you just had earnings increases, you'd have had almost the same as you had with the triple lock. Because we've had such a bizarre economy since 2010, it's turned out to be very different to what I think people expected when they put it in place.
Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll let you go and digest every page of those books in front of you for the rest of the afternoon and evening. I know. Don't say I never give you anything, Paul. Let's go to Hull and talk to the BBC's political editor for Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. Tim Iredale is there. He had guests before the statement. Let's find out what people there think of what Jeremy Hunt announced.
Joe, thank you. Welcome back to Marfleet Community Centre in Hull. A lot has happened since we last spoke to you before the speech. It's good now to at least put a little bit of meat on the bones. Now, Becky Hart, who's the Regional Director of the CBI in Yorkshire and the Humber, joined us earlier. Did Jeremy Hunt tell you what you wanted to hear?
Well, whilst it was really good to see the move on national insurance for hard-pressed households, something we spoke about a lot about earlier, I think the news about full capital expensing being made permanent is a really great news for the business community, of which many of our members have spoken about and asked us to really campaign for.
And you were hopeful of a devolution deal for this area for Hull and East Yorkshire.
Yep.
You got it.
And it's great to see devolution deals on both sides of the Humber in that regard. And we really hope that we'll see some really good messaging from the two joint mayors when they eventually arrive. And I think it's a great opportunity for sort of putting the area on the map and promoting business investment opportunities.
Let's hear from one of our new guests. Mukesh Tikoti is a restaurateur here in East Yorkshire. Now, you were talking earlier about a subject on which many people will be familiar, the cost of living, the cost of produce in your restaurant. Did the Chancellor do anything to address that?
Yes, I think thank you so much for them, what they're doing. I think they extended the business rate for another years for 75% discount. This will help us, definitely. It will help us. And then duty on the drinks. So which is help us to no increase in the price, so people can come to restaurant afford reasonable price. So I think this is a good start, and we look forward to receiving all these benefits.
You were also talking about staff retention. Many businesses, especially in the hospitality sector, find it hard sometimes to hang on to staff. What about the National Insurance Cut?
Yeah,
will that make it easier?
Yeah, this is will be help, but they're reducing now. So on the moment, it's a labor cost, the biggest problem for all businesses. So the quality staff or good staff. And a whole space in this area, if you want to bring the staff from abroad or from the London or big cities, the wages quite high. So when you pay the high wages, so you pay the contribution quite a lot, which is the effect of the business. So I think this may help us. So what they planning for the next year?
So a cautious welcome from you to Jeremy Hunt's statement earlier. Let me bring in Angus West, Director of Garth West, a packaging company here in Hull. He's also a prominent Brexiteer in the city. We'll hold Brexit just for now, but just on the autumn statement itself, Angus, was that a good statement or a bad statement for you?
Well, I would say, you could say too little too late. This could have all been done about a year ago. I mean, it was Liz Truss and Kwesi Kwarteng's plans a year ago. So thank goodness they've finally come. I mean, the one thing that I suppose for small and medium-sized enterprises with the increase to 25% on corporation tax, which is very unwelcome. There is 100% capital allowances now if you're buying new equipment for your business. We are a manufacturing company. We do invest heavily in capital equipment, and we are looking at that area at the moment. But that's all about spending money to improve your business. And okay, that is going to be 100% a tax write-off. So that is good. I welcome that. But there's far more that should be done for particularly manufacturing businesses and small businesses in this country. That's how we create wealth, how we increase the wealth, the size of the wealth cake, and that's what this country needs.
Interesting. You actually said that the Liz Truss Kwarteng budget was a good budget.
It could have been if it had been allowed to go forward, yes. And this has adopted many things that they were talking about in the 44 or 46 days that Liz was Prime Minister. So, it's almost as if they've come a year later. And a lot of these were the ideas and policies that Liz Truss and Kwesi Kwarteng were espousing 12 months ago.
It could be fair to say that people are maybe talking about Brexit again, maybe because that fella Farage is in the jungle right now. Now, you are a prominent Brexiteer. Do you believe Brexit has been good for this area?
I think Brexit has not actually been fully implemented. There have been a lot of people trying to prevent that. I believe if we do actually go with Brexit, the opportunities are huge for this country, but we've got to do it properly. And that's something I guess Nigel have talked about and the Brexiteers have talked about. But there have been impediments all throughout the time since the vote in 2016 and all the messing about. It's about time we actually did Brexit properly and became an independent sovereign nation, responsible for our own actions, for our own trade laws and everything else.
This is a city that voted in large number, 2/3 voted in favour of Brexit. Is there still a big Brexit effect on the economy of this area?
I think it's really difficult to say, to be honest, because there's been so many other things that have come into the mix since the Brexit vote. Really, the impact of the pandemic has been huge on this area, and I think really we want to work with the good business community. We want to work with the local leadership to make sure this area, through a devolution deal, can really rise up above that and really sort of achieve the heights it really wants to.
Well, very diplomatically put. We're going to have to leave it. I suspect this is a discussion that will continue here at the Marfleet Community Centre, but I know we have to go back to you, Joe.
Now, Tim Ardell there in Hull at the Marfleet Community Centre. Thank you very much, and thank you to your guests. Picking up on one of the points, there was a little bit of, can I put it, nostalgia for some of the measures that one of the guests was talking about when Liz Truss was Prime Minister and Kwesi Kwarteng was Chancellor. He said that actually some of the things that they were trying to do have now happened in this particular autumn statement. Do you think that's true?
Well, it's certainly the case that there are lots of Tory MPs, some, lots, who at the time said, look, actually what they were trying to do wasn't necessarily wrong. It was the way they set about it. So not having those OBR forecasts. I mean, you know, we're poring over it to see what does it mean. If you don't do that, it makes it look like you're not wanting someone to mark your homework. So I think that was part of the problem. They didn't prepare people. You know, it was the way they did it, not necessarily what they were trying to do. And so there will be Tory MPs who would say, no, if we'd done some of this a year ago, where would we be now in terms of growth forecasts, for example? I mean, obviously you never know, do you? But certainly that some of the things they were aiming for were the right things to do, given that there's such a problem when it comes to the growth forecasts.
But the same caution applies here, because when you do these what are called supply side measures, where you try and improve the workings of the economy, lots of little micro measures, it does take some time for it to come through, as it would have done for Liz Truss.
Which is why they weren't given the benefit of the doubt, as they would probably see it.
And I think from what Jeremy Hunt would probably say is, well, we've put in place the kind of tough measures on borrowing, earned the credibility, and now we can kind of do these measures that go for growth. But in terms of the electoral cycle, it's going to take 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. Some of the stuff about improving business investment doesn't come through until after the forecast ends in 5 years' time. The Treasury have assumed it for a decade's time at raising 20 billion. That's pretty impressive, right?
Well, Rishi Sunak said he was making long-term decisions.
Well, I mean, and there is, there's a benefit to long-term decisions that don't have an immediate upfront, electoral dividend, right? You know, some of these decisions are tough. But the reason why they're tough and they take years is because if they're going to affect growth, they're going to be politically difficult. Like pylons across the country will cause a political pylon, as it were.
Yes.
Planning problems. We know all of this stuff, right?
Yes. I mean, Simon, is that the case? I mean, they do take time, don't they?
Well, the tax cut comes in almost immediately in January, right? So there's a crowd pleaser right there.
And they were very pleased.
But things like, upgrading the national grid, getting the planning consents, our energy network, these, famously take ages. And attempts to try and shortcut or speed up the planning process. Many governments have foundered on the rocks, on those particular rocks. It just doesn't work. You saw what happened with our housing targets, for example.
Wow.
Also, those are some of the issues. I think overall, and the other point I would make on this is that the biggest single ticket measure was this full expensing. If you're a business, you can go out, buy some new stuff and knock that off your profits. And that businesses call for that. But that is that works if you're a manufacturer and you want a shiny new factory. If you're in professional services, which is a service-based economy, it's going to be much harder to access those tax breaks. It's not going to help if you're just buying a new piece of software or you're whatever, or leasing stuff or buying second-hand stuff. It doesn't apply to you. And I think a lot of business will say we like the ambition, but it doesn't. What is it doing for me?
What about cost of living? Because those pressures are still enormous for many millions of households. Inflation, the rate of inflation has come down to 4.6% and is on a trajectory to come down further, although not, I think, until 2025. That's the forecast to 2%, which is the Bank of England target. The money that will go back into people's pockets, or won't leave it, if you like, because of that cut to national insurance, will it make people feel better off?
But the problem is, as we've said before, about the inflation rate coming down, it's a very basic point. Prices are still going up.
Absolutely.
So it's not that prices have started to come down. Everyone knows when they go to the shops, they don't ever expect something to go down in price.
No.
Whatever has gone up will probably stay around that price. Now, it's not, there's some things which will come down a little bit, but generally. And the other problem is that that hasn't fed through the economy yet. I think there was some statistics, only about half of that impact. So people on mortgages who will still have to remortgage, and again, this plays into when do you call an election, there's still lots of people who in the next year will have to remortgage at a higher rate than they had. So actually, the full impact of this hasn't even been felt for lots of people. So you could argue for some that there's still worse to come on all of this.
But on the other hand, you will get cash increases to benefits of 6.7%.
Yeah.
Pensions going up 8.5%.
Yeah.
The national minimum wage up about 10 to 12%. At some of the younger ages, up 20%, actually.
Yes.
So at the time that inflation is falling. So I think there will be a material impact from that.
That's the judgment, of course, they were hoping for, wasn't it? The government. That it would be falling and those benefits would be higher.
So it is a fascinating thing. Do you feel, will it feel like 2024 is sort of light at the end of the tunnel, or will people feel so weighed down by the past couple of years of that squeeze? You showed the chart, record squeeze.
Depends how far your memory goes back. You could think, well, before the pandemic, how was I feeling in terms of how wealthy I was? And now, I mean, it's you might think, well, I feel better off than I did a year ago, but this is all under the same government.
But the danger, I think, is if what you're suggesting, would there be a short-term sugar rush, and people think, actually, do you know what, my pension's going up sort of 9% or what have you, and I'm 21 years old, my living wage is going up by 20%. I've got a bit more money in my pocket, I go out and spend it. To what extent does that sort of, if you like, prolong higher interest rates, make the Bank of England think I'm going to keep rates higher for longer, therefore my mortgage is more expensive, therefore my borrowing costs if I'm a business stay higher than they otherwise have stayed? That will be the interesting
well, I like your phrase, that the short-term sugar rush. I mean, that is what the government will be hoping for, no doubt, in their calculations about when to go for a general election. I mean, just to underline what you were saying about prices, if you have a look at the prices, the change in prices, the increase between January 21 and October last month 23. I mean, look at the percentage increases, and as you say, much of that baked in. A whopping 82% in energy. The government did do a significant amount to help people with those increases for a portion of time, and the same with businesses, which I think is still continuing, of course. What will it mean in terms of timing for the next election, then?
Well, the fact that the national insurance cut comes in January, again, before today, I was thinking, well, a lot of this, normally those tax changes don't come until next April, at which point you've already had then a March budget before that, so you're sort of running ahead of yourself, aren't you? But obviously, by doing it in January, there certainly will be some people in Westminster thinking, well, look, that leaves the option open, potentially, to have a little bit more of an impact for people. But when you're looking at price rises like we've seen there, for some people, that means they've got into debt. For other people who are lucky enough to have savings, it might mean they've used up a lot of their savings. I just don't think it just goes away because for, say, 3 or 4 months, you've, got a slightly more in your pay packet.
And two very tangible things. Tomorrow, whilst the Chancellor is preparing for his breakfast media round, Ofgem will release the new price cap, which at the minute, we're told, might actually go up. I think unexpectedly for many people who thought, oh, it's coming down now, finally it's coming down. But it could just bounce back up again, not a huge amount, but £100 set against, some tax savings.
I think they've already put out some messages saying it's going to go up.
So that's a tricky one. And then it does boil down, I think, for a lot of people, to what happens to interest rates. And whether you're the Central Bank of England, looking at this, thinking, we can continue on our path. Because although it wouldn't be a huge move if it did move, I think that the government would clearly want to sell this as, OK, we really are turning around now. Interest rates are starting to come down. The Bank of England yesterday, in front of MPs, were a little bit sceptical about the idea, the presumption in markets, that interest rates would definitely come down within the next 6 to 7 months.
Well, let's get some more political reaction. Ben Thompson is on College Green. Ben.
Joe, thanks so much. We've been talking about exactly that. When could there be a general election? When will that happen? With me on College Green to talk about some of the reactions to what we've heard from Jeremy Hunt. With us, Ed Davey, leader of the Liberal Democrats, and also Dave Dugan from the SNP. Afternoon to you both. Afternoon. So the Chancellor says this is an autumn statement for growth, Ed Davey. Is it?
It's a big deception on the British people. Jeremy Hunt said he was cutting taxes for the basic rate taxpayer by £450. Actually, he's raising taxes by £400 when you take into account the fact that he's frozen national insurance allowance, frozen income tax allowance, big rises in tax. And this tax rising Conservative government is doing it at a time when people can't afford it. If you look at the Independent Office of Budget Responsibilities report published today, it shows that people are suffering from the biggest reduction in living standards since the 1950s. So no wonder people are upset with the Conservatives. The cost of living crisis goes on.
This is about getting people back into work, though, isn't it, Dave Dugan? The OBR is saying that reducing a tax on work means more people in work, and that is good for the economy, is it not?
Well, it will be good for the economy if that's the way it pans out, but the most pernicious element of this autumn statement was the way that the Chancellor championed putting disabled people into an impossible situation and threatening to remove all benefits from them
altogether throwing disabled people to the wolves and red meat to his backbenchers. But this is a deceptive autumn statement. It doesn't give any kind of solution to hard-pressed households up and down these islands and in Scotland over energy prices. That's the issue of the moment. Energy prices 83% higher than they were in 2021, and no £400 rebate to help people with that. There's nothing in here for mortgage interest relief after the Tories, the same Tories that are championing this autumn statement, tanked the economy just a year ago. There's nothing in here to help people with food prices, and there's nothing in here that can compete with the Scottish Government's council tax freeze and Scottish child payment. So it's a phony budget prospectus. You talk a lot about what we didn't get. What we did get was an incentive to work, which is a reduction in national insurance. The average, we're told, could save people £450 a year. An increase in pensions in line with a higher figure, the September figure, not the October figure for inflation. The same for benefits too. That is giving money to people who are working, particularly. That's the point, isn't it? People who are in work.
But the problem is, Ben, it doesn't touch the sides of that which people are having to bear. When they can't pay their mortgage, they can't afford their groceries, and they can't afford to switch the heating on, getting a few quid extra off your tax bill isn't going to make the difference. The Chancellor's not being honest with people. He was in there today talking about reducing Class 2 national insurance for self-employed people earning less than £12,500 a year. That's a few pounds a month for not very many people. He's not been clear with the UK population, and they are absolutely clear-eyed about that. We don't have a Chancellor with his hand on the tiller. We've got a Prime Minister directing his Chancellor to do what he thinks he has to do to make the damage as little as possible at the next election. And the sooner that election comes, the better.
One of the biggest drivers of growth, of course, will be business, getting business back up and running, business investment. The Chancellor describing his full expensing tax relief as the biggest business tax cuts in modern times. That means that business can be at the front of this build back to make the economy grow, to create jobs, to make us feel better off. That's a step in the right direction, isn't it?
Well, Liberal Democrats back business, back growth. The problem is what the Chancellor didn't say, another deception, that the Conservatives have increased business taxation over this Parliament by record amounts. What we need, if we're going to grow the economy, is to help people back to work, as the Chancellor said, but he's got the wrong ideas. If we cut the NHS waiting lists, if we help people back to work who are on these very long waiting lists, that would make a huge difference. And what Liberal Democrats have been saying is there's far too many people who have been forced out of work and not able to get back to work because they can't see their GP, they can't get the operation, they can't get the treatment they need. If we fixed our health system, which the Tories have totally underinvested in, we could fix the economy as well. And lots of businesses think that too. And the other thing that was really missing in terms of business was a very strong, stable policy on infrastructure, on railways, on energy, on water, on housing. And all the businesses I talk to say the Chancellor, the government keep changing the goalposts, keeps changing their policies, and that instability has undermined investment in our country. So across the piece, whether it's the failure to invest in the NHS, whether it's deception on tax, whether it's a failure to do infrastructure, I'm afraid this government's got it badly wrong.
All eyes will be on that possible general election. When that will be, we don't yet know. But those growth figures pretty damning, aren't they, Dave Dugan? Downgrading growth once again. Next year from 1.8% to 0.7%. In 2025, down from 2.5% to 1.4%. In 2026, down from 2.1% to 1.9%. So on average, growth being downgraded every year from here on in. Where will that growth come from? How do we get this country growing again?
Well, we won't get that growth that we need to see in the real economy under this Chancellor and under this Tory government, because the Chancellor and the Treasury that he presides over are very clear about the cost of everything and very ignorant about the price of everything. And energy is a prime example. On the Contract for Difference scheme, they get the lowest possible price, squeezing out all opportunities for a UK supply chain to develop those projects and bringing that infrastructure in from abroad. And that's just one example of many. But growth is disastrous in the United Kingdom, and it's scheduled to get worse. In the next few years, growth in the UK will be the lowest in the G7. But it's not just that that's deceptive in this autumn statement. The Chancellor himself is taking credit for getting inflation down, when actually that's monetary policy from the Bank of England. And his challenge is to make sure that the fiscal policy is in a position to marshal the resources, such as they are,
to get the economy onto the front foot and delivering for people. And the way to make sure that the economy, the real economy, is working is not having people hemorrhaging over £2,000 a year on their energy bills. And the key element to this today, which is really troubling, is the way that the Chancellor repeatedly told Parliament that debt is falling, when actually debt is rising. It's just not rising as fast as the economy. And it's a really, this government has tripled UK sovereign debt, a fact that's not very much talked about, but it really should be clear. If households tripled their debt in that way, we'd all know about it. In a word, when will the general election be? What month? I think May. Davey?
April.
There we go. Two forecasts for you here from College Green. Joe, back to you.
Thanks for that, Ben. April or May? Oh, they were very quick off the mark, weren't they? Vicky, I mean, on the Labour Party, since we've spoken to the Liberal Democrats and the SNP, what will their strategy be now?
Well, it was very interesting, wasn't it, listening to Darren Jones, because he was making the point that when Gordon Brown was in opposition, it took them quite a long time before they said, actually, we're just going to follow Conservative plans. I mean, that's the easiest thing to do in many ways, isn't it? Especially if you're 20 points ahead in the opinion poll. So the question for them is, do they think that people are so disillusioned with the Conservatives that they're just going to turn to Labour without Labour really having to offer very much? I don't think so. I think I detect from some in the shadow cabinet, they're particularly concerned about don't knows. At the recent by-elections, a lot of them were raising the point that they were saying, if after everything that's happened, someone is still a don't know, that doesn't suggest that they are champing at the bit to try and vote Labour, and they're going to have to do a bit more than that. But I think what this autumn statement does, it poses a lot of questions for Labour, doesn't it? About all sorts of things, not just about tax, but I was really struck by actually what he had to say about the NHS and public services, where he said you can't just keep pouring money into the NHS, you need to reform. Well, what's the plan for that? And there's a real feeling that, you know, a Labour government is much more able to tinker and do stuff with the NHS maybe than a Conservative government is. So, you know, I think there's a lot of questions there for Labour, and I wouldn't say we've had any answers at all.
Right, just before I come to a final comment from you, because I know you have to go, Faisal, in a few minutes' time, just to say that you've been watching Politics Live. We're on till 3:15. We're covering the autumn statement that has been delivered by Jeremy Hunt, but at this point we'll say goodbye to viewers from the news channel. Thank you for keeping us company. Faisal.
Well, I think the big picture here is that there was a sort of inflation-fuelled improvement in the public finances that was quite considerable. It was worth about £27 billion at the end of the OBR forecast period. And essentially, he's sort of spent all of that on tax cuts. It's kind of, roughly speaking, actually, £11 billion for both national insurance, which was bigger than expected, and also, as Simon has been saying, on business. And they claim this is all coherent. This is all about boosting growth, and all of it fights in the same direction and therefore helps with inflation. But clearly, when you step back, half of it is more focused at a more immediate sugar rush that may or may not help with an election, and may or may not counteract the massive tax rise we've seen in a more stealthy fashion via the thresholds. But the other half is really quite interesting in terms of long-term economic growth. And if it's successful, will help everything and all these careful trade-offs for 5, 10, 15 years. I imagine what the opposition will say is, well, if you're doing it now, why didn't you do it 13 years ago? And the answer is, this stuff is actually more difficult politically than putting it on a list in the autumn statement or the budget. All of it requires trade-offs in planning committees with your councillors, trade-offs over where the pylons are, trade-offs with, you know, who you back in terms of international investment. And it's a lot easier to put it in a document
than do it,
or list it in a press release than do it, because why didn't they do it years ago?
Yes, it's just gone 3 o'clock. We're going to go through the key measures in just a moment. But on that back to work, again, perhaps something that the government should have undertaken. They have been trying to do something in terms of encouraging people back into the workforce since the pandemic. Will it work with more stick and less carrot?
Well, it'll be very interesting with an election coming up, whether if the Labour Party were to win, will they be the ones going out to execute this policy, basically saying you have to take a job after 18 months, and after 6 months, if you haven't done that, we're going to cut off your benefits. So clearly there was a push to, as you say, shrink the carrot, sharpen the stick. There have been recruitment problems. We've heard when I speak to businesses, they say one of the toughest things is getting people into the workplace. And therefore, the other part of it was making work more attractive, which is why they plumped for national insurance contributions rather than just income tax, because you can get income from savings and investments and whatever, whereas national insurance only for those people in work. So that is the direction of travel. But as Faisal was saying, whereas you can do tax cuts, which you happen almost immediately, things like what they call supply side reforms, like things like, you know, upgrading the energy grid, investing more in transport, training, all those kind of things, take a long time and sometimes are difficult to push through, which is what, you know, why we've seen countless planning targets sort of ditched in the past. So all in all, I think tonight, if you are a big, profitable manufacturing company, you're delighted because now you can basically invest in new plant and machinery for a long time. If you're not a profitable company, it doesn't help you because there's nothing to offset your investment against. And I think there will be a bit of relief that they have done the business rates relief for an extra year for smaller businesses.
Let's say goodbye to Faisal Islam, BBC's economics editor. Thank you for keeping us company. I'll take you through some of the key measures because there are an awful lot of them, and then we're going to get some market reaction from Susanna Streeter. So let's start with these. National insurance cut from 12% to 10% from January, that 2% cut. Minimum wage to increase to £11.44 an hour from April for workers aged 21 and over, and mandatory work placements, as Simon was just talking about, for job seekers who have not found work after 18 months. Let's do one more page and then talk to Susanna. State pension to increase by 8.5% to £221.20 a week from April. Universal credit and other benefits are going to be increased from April by 6.7%, the September inflation figure. Local housing allowance rate to increase to the 30th percentile of local market rents and freeze all alcohol duty until August the 1st next year. Let's welcome Susanna Streeter. Susanna, when we think back a year ago, Jeremy Hunt was brought in as Chancellor to calm and steady the markets after weeks of market turmoil. How are they responding to his statement today?
Well, a pretty muted response, really. I think the autumn statement has largely underwhelmed the financial markets. The FTSE 100 still in negative territory. The FTSE 250, so more domestically focused, lost ground, and the pound also lower against the dollar. Obviously, what happens in the United States has an impact on that as well. But if you look at what's happening on the bond markets, well, certainly there hasn't been that much movement, and that's certainly what Jeremy Hunt would have wanted. Certainly wouldn't want to see a repeat of what happened with the Trussonomics mini budget. So we haven't seen that kind of response at all. And in fact, those very closely watched gilt yields are pretty steady. However, I do think, you know, the reaction that we've seen is that these moves are underwhelming. The worry is that actually stagnation is going to bed in. Certainly, we've had those incentives for larger businesses when it comes to offsetting the cost of machinery and IT equipment. We won't see that come through for quite a few years, but it certainly is encouraging. The thing is, there isn't a big bazooka when it comes to really putting a rocket under growth for the longer term. And I think that's why you've seen disappointment, really.
Susanna Streeter, thank you very much for joining us. Just reacting to that, Vicky, of course, Jeremy Hunt, in one sense, will be absolutely relieved that there isn't turmoil in the markets. But well, I mean, that's my question. I mean, is that the rather low bar he was trying to meet? Or is there, and has there been, some debate around the kite flying, which we have quite often, but also the pre-briefing? I mean, the Prime Minister was very clear about tax cuts coming down the track, in order to test out a little bit of reaction in the markets ahead of a statement like this?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously, having learnt the lesson from last year, preparing people, preparing the markets, but also in terms of the raw politics of it, you know, they don't just want one day of this. What they do now, and they've done this for a long time, haven't they, with budgets and with autumn statements, is that pretty much almost everything is out there because you just get more coverage and, you know, people don't apparently watch the news every single day. Some people can't find that hard to believe. But, you know, there's more time for people to think, OK, right, yes, this is what's happening. This is what you're doing for me. But I still think the real challenge, and Conservative MPs know this, don't they, that they are fighting against, you know, years of turmoil, many would say it, for all different reasons. You know, some would say Brexit being one of them. Others will obviously point to the pandemic. Then you point to the energy crisis. Not all of this has been in the government's hands, of course, but it has been under the Conservatives' stewardship. So when he says we're turning the corner, some will say, well, you're turning the corner, you're maybe trying to make right what your predecessors have done wrong. Has he got the right answers? And is it going to be enough to people to say, right, well, we do forgive some of the mistakes you've made before and we will give you another chance? I think Tory MPs just want voters to listen to them.
Yeah,
they don't want them slamming the door in their faces. They want them to give them another chance.
Is business listening to this government, or have they moved on? I mean, remember, we talk about from historical times, the prawn cocktail offensive, the offensive that Rachel Reeves and Labour have undertaken with business. Are they prepared to give the Conservatives a second chance, or have they moved on?
I think that they will think. They will, I think, appreciate some of the ambition that is in this budget. These supply-side reforms were the things that didn't happen in the Kwasi Kwarteng Liz Truss thing. What they then said, we'll do all these tax cuts and we'll tell you about the supply-side stuff later. Here they've basically laid out a pattern. And the Labour Party have already said that they are going to back this full expensing, offsetting investment against profits. So I think business will be, I think, encouraged that a government, which may only have a year left, who knows, we don't know, are actually doing some real long-term thinking stuff. And a lot of this will be tough to execute, but there is, there's real ambition to try and make the economy more productive, more profitable, and productivity, as we've always said, is the secret sauce. It means the economy can grow without pushing up inflation.
It's been elusive up until now, hasn't it, in recent times? Let's get some more reaction from our guests in Hull. Tim Iredale is there. Tim.
Joe, thank you. Let me just go straight to Debbie Morell, who's a local hairdresser and community volunteer. We talked at the beginning of our programme here in Marfleet, in the east of Hull, about how this area, it's a low-wage economy. Many people are on long-term benefits. Is that going to change as a result of today, do you believe?
No, I don't imagine it will do. I think that this community, once again, has been let down by the government. The challenges that we face are complex. It's not straight. There's not a straightforward answer. But as a business owner, it's challenging. Increasing the living wage as has happened, that would be having to be absorbed by a business owner, and that's not something that I can directly pass on to my customers.
So that's going to be a real struggle for you, is it? The increase in the minimum wage, the national living wage that was announced this week? That's going to be a struggle for your business.
Things are a struggle for my business in this area, full stop. This is an area of struggle. This is what this community faces daily, with cuts to public services, cuts, there's cuts all around. People are desperate for things to change, and nothing that's happened today will affect change for the good for our community.
Let me bring in Mike Whitehead, local businessman, a past president of the Hull and Humber Chamber of Commerce. I also should say you chair the Hull West and Halton Price Conservative Party. That's a new constituency. Debbie there was very critical. Nothing will change as a result of today's announcements. How do you react to that?
Well, I understand her particular point of view, but the main thing that's particularly exciting about the Chancellor's statement is the fact that the Humber is getting 2 mayoral authorities, and we're going to have elected mayors on the North Bank and the South Bank. So that is a game changer, and that should improve the economy massively, and that should filter down to more investment, more jobs, and improvements generally.
Do people really want another layer of government in this area, another layer of bureaucracy?
Well, it's not a layer of bureaucracy. It doesn't actually. The mayor will not be responsible for changing emptying the bins. This is the chief executives of development corporations. This is about standing up for the Humber, bringing investment into the area, growing existing jobs, improving skills, and making sure that we don't lose the jobs that we've got here already.
Just briefly, will today's announcement, will it make it easier for you to win your constituency at the next election? Because it looks like quite a close battle there between the Conservatives and Labour.
Well, from that point of view, I honestly do not know. But from a Chamber's point of view, it does mean that we've got something that we've been pushing for a long while. And we have to put great congratulations to Anne Hanley, who's a pocket battleship, and she's done a marvellous piece of work. Yeah. And also Mike Ross.
Well, yeah, leaders of the local councils. Kate, let me just bring you back in. You were with us earlier. You're from Tyne Bank Hull. You were here just before the autumn statement. What's your reaction? Low-paid area, people on long-term benefits. Will what the Chancellor announced today, will he change any of that?
Well, I think it's positive that there's a rise in the minimum wage, the living wage, and also in benefits as well, in line with inflation. But what really worries me is, again, there's a focus on people who have the least, who are on benefits, people who are experiencing mental health problems, and this thing about getting people back into work. And, yeah, and that is... Yeah,
I think you made your point. More to do from the Chancellor. I
think the point is people with mental health problems, they have loads to offer, but maybe can't hold on full-time work, and actually focusing on them as a way to get out of this is a problem. Yeah.
You're reacting to possible benefit sanctions there. Yeah. We have to leave it there. Some interesting comments, some thoughts here at Marfleet Community Centre today, proving, Joe, of course, it is never dull in Hull.
Well, it's... Thank you for that mantra, Tim Iredale there at the Marfleet Community Centre. Let me just pick up on one point. We haven't got long now to the end of the show. Hairdresser Debbie saying the living wage is all well and good, but she's going to have to absorb those costs. And, you know, she's already struggling with her business.
Yeah, this came out earlier in the week. They're going to put it up by around 10% to £11.44, but also bring the threshold down for when you qualify it from 23 to 21. So younger workers. So some people who have got young workers, like hairdressers, like retail, like hospitality, are looking at a 15 to 20% rise in their wage bill, and they were very, very concerned about that. One salve, if you like, for today was that they're going to get the business rates discount on smaller premises will be extended, and also in hospitality there was a freeze on alcohol duty, so that will be really welcomed. Right. But yes, if you're a big, as I say, big manufacturer, you're loving the big expensing. Right. If you're in the service industry, there's less to cheer here.
Vicky.
It's interesting, OBR here saying that Jeremy Hunt has spent the headroom. We keep talking about 27 billion.
Yes.
He's done all that. Tory MPs will be greedy. I think they'll want more. They'll all be looking now to the March budget to say, is there anything more you can give us?
Please, sir.
Well, there'll be lots more speculation about the timing of a general election as the Chancellor has delivered his autumn statement with tax cuts, that 2% cut to national insurance. We'll be chewing over everything this evening before I'm back here in the studio to look at it again with Politics Live at 12:15. But from all of us here in Westminster at the end of another very big day. Bye-bye.
Good evening.
For 70 years,